Coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, mixed messages from the White House and Iran.
The Iranians want to talk. They want to talk in person.
America's special envoys fly to Pakistan today, but will there be direct talks between the parties?
Plus, a pivot on Powell. The Justice Department drops its investigation into the Fed chair.
And we shouldn't be holding our nation's economy hostage because of a disagreement with the Department of Justice.
What does it mean for President Trump's pick to replace him?
And the president puts his mark on the nation's capital, from the White House ballroom to the planned arch to gold, everything else.
What style is that? Is that neoclassical? Is that early Mar-a-Lago? Does it have a name?
I think Mar-a-Lago might be closer.
Okay, all right.
How Trump is changing the face of Washington.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is Saturday, April 25th. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across all our Bloomberg platforms, radio, TV, streaming, Bloomberg.com, and, of course, the Bloomberg Business app.
We are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. this weekend. It is the weekend of the White House Correspondents Association dinner.
It is Nerd Prom, and we are here for it.
I have a tuxedo. I believe it fits. Tune in
tried
tomorrow and find out if, in fact, it has been sized appropriately. But
if David and I are here tomorrow in our formal wear, you know something has gone very wrong overnight. But
or right.
We're ready. We're ready for any occasion. And you know who else is ready for any occasion? Lisa Mateo here with the headlines. What you got, Lisa?
You got it, guys. Let's get to it now. The White House says that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, intend to meet with Iranian officials in Pakistan this weekend to try and end the war. Now, absent from the talks, Vice President J.D. Vance, the lead negotiator for the U.S., Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
The Vice President, the Secretary of State, will be waiting here in the United States for updates, and the Vice President, I understand, is on standby and will be willing to dispatch to Pakistan if we feel it's a necessary use of his time.
Meanwhile, Iran's top diplomat landed in Pakistan. A spokesperson for Iran's foreign ministry said he will meet only with Pakistani officials with no talks planned with the U.S. Leavitt claims the Iranians had reached out to the U.S. to arrange the fresh round of talks. And this all comes as the U.S. increased pressure on Iran with its naval blockade, while Israel and Lebanon are set to extend a ceasefire for 3 weeks. President Donald Trump ordered the U.S. Navy to shoot any boats putting mines in the Strait of Hormuz after the military intercepted 2 oil supertankers that tried to evade restrictions on traffic to and from Iran's ports. Now to the war in Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia carried out one of the largest attacks on Ukraine overnight, killing 4 people and leaving over 30 wounded across the country. Ukraine's general staff said Russia launched nearly 50 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and more than 600 drones. And in other news, U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro is dropping her investigation into Fed Chair Jay Powell in relation to building renovation cost overruns by the central bank. In a social media post, Pirro said that the Fed's Inspector General is looking into it and that she will not hesitate to restart a criminal investigation if their report calls for it. The move potentially clears a path to confirmation for Kevin Warsh, President Donald Trump's pick to be the next chair of the central bank. And U.S. Special Forces soldier charged with using classified information to win money on Polymarket, well, he's been released on bond. Federal prosecutors say Master Sergeant Gannon Ken Van Dyke, he used inside information about the mission to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to win more than $400,000 on Polymarket. He's been ordered to appear Tuesday in the U.S. District Court in Manhattan, where he's been indicted on wire fraud and other charges. Christina and David.
This is a wild story.
That is a crazy story. And as we talk about Polymarkets all the time, I think there's just going to be more and more of this.
Yeah, and I think press just the fact that, there are these concerns, Capitol Hill, other regulators saying that this needs to be more closely looked at.
100%. But how do you enforce, and do you have the capacity to do that?
Yeah,
Thanks,
fascinating
Lisa.
to watch that unfold. Lisa, thank you very much. Well, as Lisa reported, President Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, they are set to get back on a plane to Islamabad, Pakistan, their second trip for talks since the Iran war began nearly 2 months ago. While Iran's foreign minister is also in Islamabad for meetings, it remains to be seen whether Iran will be willing to sit down with the U.S. to continue discussions of a permanent ceasefire.
That's right. Joining us now from Islamabad is Bloomberg's senior reporter Dan Strumpf, Bloomberg's deputy UAE bureau chief Abir Abu Omar in Dubai, and Bloomberg's senior White House reporter Josh Wingrove, who's traveling with the president in Florida. Dan, I want to start with you since you're on the ground there. Part of the problem throughout this conflict has been different messaging from both within these parties and cross-talking between them. We heard the White House press secretary say they are going to have talks. Iran has said they haven't agreed to talks. Will they be talking? What's going on? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, the confusion is absolutely palpable here on the ground in Islamabad as well. The Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is indeed in Islamabad having meetings with Pakistani officials as we speak. Now, what remains to be seen is if the foreign minister will be meeting with the U.S. delegation, which, as you mentioned, is expected to arrive in Islamabad at some point this weekend. The two sides are really far apart on a lot of issues. Of course, the control of the Strait of Hormuz remains the sort of central sticking point that's holding off talks between the two sides. I think what you may end up seeing here in Islamabad is sort of, each side kind of arrives, passes messages to the Pakistanis who are acting as the intermediary in these negotiations, and then they go their separate ways and sort of continue to talk about talking, if you will. But again, much remains to be seen. It's still only Saturday here in Islamabad, so we'll see what happens.
Joshua Grove, let me go to you next. And I'm curious about who's going and who's not going. So we have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, also the National Security Advisor, archivist as well, I should note, remaining here in Washington, D.C. J.D. Vance, the Vice President, not going as well. Here's what the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt had to say about that yesterday.
The Vice President, the Secretary of State, will be waiting here in the United States for updates, and the Vice President, I understand, is on standby and will be willing to dispatch to Pakistan if we feel it's a necessary use of his time.
Josh, you're traveling with the president, and I'm curious what the administration's perspective on these talks is, how much optimism they have that this is going to lead to not only a ceasefire, but I guess before that, just a meeting itself.
Yeah, David, good morning, and thank you. Yeah, I am traveling with him. Unfortunately, I'm not on the Mar-a-Lago guest list, you can imagine, so I apologize. I look like I'm being held in a nondescript location by the Emperor of Marriott. Bear with me here. This is life in West Palm Beach.
You're getting your points, and we're happy for that, Josh.
That's right,
yes.
That's right. The White House, on the one hand, I think, is wanting to signal disinterest in these talks. If they wanted to put a foot down on them, they would have sent Vance. The fact that they're not, I think, is a signal they want to send. I don't know how material it is, though, because Witkoff and Kushner, of course, have a pretty direct, literally direct line to the president and are pretty empowered to do that. There's been some sort of frustration in American circles that they believe that their delegation is being sent and, empowered to talk and negotiate there. Of course, one of the snags that we've heard from American officials is that they think that the Iranians are not able to do that, in part out of security concerns and the undisclosed location of the supreme leader. They don't, so they think they're hitting a logjam on that. And so I think expectations are low. The fact that on the American side of some sort of immediate breakthrough, the fact that talks are happening, I suppose, are a positive. I think it's important just to remember, as we noted there, but just to emphasize it, the standoff on the Strait is sort of a chicken and egg scenario, right? Like what we have here is the Strait was closed suddenly again by Iran because of the blockade. Trump says the blockade is until they get a deal, including opening the Strait. So it's a battle of wills right now, whether that particular piece will open. And there were a lot of great pieces on the terminal in the past few days about the mounting pressures on the energy markets in particular, and how long we can sort of run on reserves until this thing really starts to cascade through the economy.
And Abir, I want to ask you about how this is being perceived in the region, because obviously we talk about the Gulf is not a monolith, and we know that. But the GCC states, recently they've been a little quieter than they were when, they were actively under fire from Iran. I don't know what you've heard, but diplomats I've spoken to in the region don't have a lot of confidence in these talks. They don't have a lot of confidence in Pakistan as a mediator. Do they think the U.S. is approaching this the right way to end this conflict anytime soon?
Yeah, good morning. So look, you're absolutely right. And Josh and Dan sort of alluded to this perfectly. First of all, the Strait of Hormuz remains the sticking point here, but I've been back in Dubai for a week now, and I've been meeting some officials and trying to understand what the perspective is or how it's changed over the past couple of weeks or so, certainly since the ceasefire was announced. And what really stood out to me was we reported earlier, about a week ago, that Gulf officials and some Western officials believe that reaching a deal between the U.S. and Iran would take about 6 months. And that was solidified to me when I arrived in Dubai. Speaking to some officials, they don't think that things are going to go back to direct firings over capital capital cities in the GCC, but they do think that the Iranians will take this as long as possible and not come to concessions. And I'm just seeing some Arabic media outlets reporting here on my screen. And this is, Dan is obviously there, but this is not verified reporting by Bloomberg. But some media, Arabic media reports suggest that Arakshi in Islamabad is suggesting that the Iranians would rather deal with J.D. Vance, that the Iranians are not going to come to concessions, and that they're sticking to the 10 points that they've laid out initially, essentially no compromise. And that brings into the question the double blockade that we're seeing across the Strait of Hormuz and what contingency plans those GCC countries are considering to sort of avoid that and get their oil shipments across.
Abir, I want to ask you about the state of Iran today, Iranian leadership, and something the president brings up here in the U.S. a lot is that there's a lot of fractions there. It's not a unified voice coming from Iranian leadership right now. There was a great piece in the Times this week about the supreme leader, just about his health, how he's doing, and I'll quote a bit from it. He was gravely wounded. He's mentally sharp and engaged, according to 4 senior Iranian officials familiar with his health. One leg was operated on 3 times. He's awaiting a prosthetic. He had surgery on one hand and is slowly regaining function. His face and lips have been burned severely, making it difficult for him to speak, the officials said, adding that eventually he will need plastic surgery. So confirming what we've heard from the administration here in the U.S., that he was injured in one of these attacks. What is the latest that we know about sort of who is in control, who is kind of leading the charge for the Iranians when it comes to these talks and trying to find some solution here?
Yeah, and look, I saw that piece as well, and it sort of, again, brings into light the conversation that we've had earlier. The start of this, we're about to enter the 60th day of this war, and no sign from the new Khamenei as of yet. And this article sort of explains why that is, and he remains in a hidden location. There were a lot of reports about his health and where he is, but it remains the people that remain in charge that President Trump refers to as the new people that are sort of more rational, the new regime that he refers to, are those ones that are going to Islamabad. At the forefront of those are Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who is in Islamabad today. There are reports about him likely going to Oman next, possibly Russia as well. Those are unverified yet. Oman was obviously a key mediator before all of this started. But at the forefront, those people are the people that we keep hearing about. You've got Araghchi, you've got Qaribaf, who's also part of the delegation that is in charge of those talks in Islamabad this week, David.
Dan, you heard Abir say that people are thinking this could go on for 6 months. Are you ready to hang out in Pakistan for 6 months? And I also want to ask you, what is at stake for the Pakistanis? They've really put themselves out there. They're very proud of hosting this talks. This is, I don't want to say a first, but in recent memory, this is the first time they've been in this position. If it doesn't work and if it continues not to work, do they lose face on the diplomatic stage?
Well, to your first question, I mean, Islamabad is just absolutely overrun with journalists at the moment, sort of in this hurry up and wait mode, just waiting to see what happens. So we'll be here as long as we're welcome. That being said, I mean, for Pakistan, you're absolutely right. I mean, so much is at stake here. This government has really positioned itself, gone out of its way to position itself as the go-between between these two warring nations. It's in a really quite unique position right now in the world of having positive relations with all sides of this conflict, essentially. Of course, President Trump and the leadership in Pakistan are quite close. Pakistan has good relations with Iran as well. Pakistan has good relations with China and a large number of the Gulf countries as well, that are all deeply involved in this conflict. So it is in a unique position. It has invited the two sides here once already, and is really sort of putting all its chips on the table and trying to bring everybody together. And Pakistan itself also has a lot to lose if this war continues. I mean, this is a country that is itself economically on the rocks. It's on an IMF program. It has fuel shortages that are being exacerbated by the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. So it too has an interest and a stake in ending this war. So it definitely does want things to wind up soon. Now, whether that happens in the coming days, we'll certainly wait and see.
Josh, we don't have a ton of time left, but we talked earlier about the fact that Vance and Rubio are not going. And Abir referenced this a little bit. It's the inadequacy of the players even going to these talks. You know, in diplomacy, little things really matter. And the fact that Iran's foreign minister is there, the U.S. Secretary of State is not, his equivalent is not going to these talks. How does the White House think they're going to get progress if they're not showing up kind of seriously for the debate?
I mean, Trump likes leverage. I'm sure he sees potential leverage and sort of holding back a chess piece that he can then deploy. But at the same time, Witkoff has a remarkably unusual role by comparison to past administrations. So, you know, this is
true. That's a good point.
And to say nothing of Kushner. So, you know, this is not, I suppose, in some ways all that wild. You know, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has not played a huge role in these talks that has left the impression that he is somewhat, you know, removed from this. I think that that's an interesting dynamic in the palace intrigue sort of perspective. But as for the president, you know, sources have insisted that he's not bored with this, but he does not appear overly interested. On the flight down last night, he did not talk to us. He was truthing or tweeting about, you know, renovations of fountains and what they're doing to the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. He was talking about crowds at his inauguration the day before that. I mean, he is on so many other different subjects right now. It does not feel like he's, you know, facing a ton of urgency. Meanwhile, he is starting to really feel a pinch, not only of energy prices, but of coal declines right domestically at home. So that is, speaking of leverage, what Iran thinks it has.
Josh Windrow is going to come back here next hour. Josh Windrow covers the White House for us here at Bloomberg News. Abir Abu Omar, our deputy UAE bureau chief, and Dan Strumpf doing yeoman's duty in Islamabad. Maybe
Thanks, Dan. Nice to have you on the show. We appreciate it.
As well. I want to go back to what you were talking about, which is this kind of matching up diplomat to diplomat. We know that before these talks were announced, there was a lot of disagreement. The Iranians made it known that if Vice President Vance wasn't going to be there, they were going to hold back who they were going to send. As you say, this is something that is practiced in diplomatic circles, matching people like that.
And that's, again, we've talked about the fact that the lack of formality with this administration can be productive, right? Like barreling through some of those red tapes and getting stuff done. But there's a reason all that red tape exists, and it's so that when you get to these meetings, you don't have to worry about all that stuff and you can focus on the substance, because that stuff can be really distracting, especially if Iran feels slighted and they're already, you know, trying to get to the table. So.
Vance, Trump laying bare how odd the optics of this are. You have the Iranian foreign minister there holding a variety of meetings. We have these two emissaries of the Trump administration likely making their way to Pakistan very soon. Yet these things happening in parallel. No indication yet that they're going to meet.
Do you think Rubio and Vance have like an Iran beeper that they're going to wear around town in case they got to get on the plane?
Yeah. All right. It's a busy weekend here. Maybe they need that. Yeah.
Coming up, the Department of Justice drops its investigation into Fed Chair Jerome Powell. Will that clear the way for President Trump's pick to replace him? That's straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend, coming to you live from the nation's capital. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. Stick with us. We have a lot more news ahead.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. Residents in a town north of Oklahoma City, they are picking up the pieces after violent tornadoes damaged about 40 homes but spared lives. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt.
Just heart goes out to these folks, and we'll do whatever we can. The Oklahoma standard will be in display as neighbors help neighbors, and we come together.
The National Weather Service says the EF4 tornado was on the ground for 9 miles, packing winds of 170 to 175 miles per hour. Well, from tornadoes to fires in southeast Georgia, more than 120 homes have been destroyed, while thousands more remain threatened by 2 large blazes. Investigators, well, they believe one of the fires was sparked by a foil balloon touching power lines. And in northern Florida, a volunteer firefighter died battling a wildfire. In company news, NVIDIA has extended its lead as the world's most valuable company. Shares rose to their first record in months on Friday, pushing its market cap to more than $5 trillion. Expectations that massive spending on AI computing infrastructure continue to drive the rally. And Google plans to invest up to $40 billion in Anthropic. The Alphabet-owned company is committing to invest $10 billion now in cash at a $350 billion valuation. Dave and Christina, the rest, another $30 billion if they hit certain performance targets. So big money for big tech.
Still a lot of big numbers here.
It doesn't seem to be slowing down.
No.
Not yet anyway. No. Thanks, Lisa. A surprise announcement here in Washington on Friday involving the criminal investigation into outgoing Fed Chair Jerome Powell. The Department of Justice suddenly dropping its inquiry, potentially clearing the way for President Trump's pick to succeed Powell.
With us now is Bloomberg's Enda Curran and Chris Strom. We've been reporting on this ongoing drama, Enda from the Fed side. Chris, from the DOJ side. And let me start with you. I'll put up the tweet here from Jeanine Pirro, the Post on X, I should say, indicating that she's dropping this, sending it over to the Fed's IG. Help me understand something, because back in July, we had the Fed chair do essentially the same thing. There has been an IG investigation underway already. What's changed as a result of this? I mean, it's an off-ramp. It was always going to reach a point, this investigation, whereby the president had to make a call. Either carry on with the investigation or drop it in order to get his pick for the Fed chair confirmed, which is, of course, Kevin Warsh. And we're at that crunch point now. Mr. Warsh has had his hearing in the Senate. He clearly has support, with the exception of Tom Tillis, who's holding out because of the investigation. Obviously, the off-ramp here is drop the investigation, you get your candidate confirmed, and you move on with your agenda for the Fed. Now, we're not quite there yet. Sounds so easy. It sounds so easy. It's an element of a shocked but no surprise here type thing. But we don't yet know, of course, how Senator Tillis will respond to this. Is it going to be enough for him or not?
Who do you think got through to the president? Because we've been covering this for a while, and even Republicans who are big supporters, as we mentioned, had gently said, like, we would prefer he moved on with this, and he didn't seem to want to. What changed?
Didn't seem to want to at all. There was escalation up to recent weeks, commentary from him, commentary from Ms. Pirro, all making the point that they were going hard against Mr. Powell. I think it comes back to the idea that hold on a second. We have your candidate to run the Fed, the person you want. We've now had the hearing. We clearly have support from him among Republican GOP makers. Chairman Powell's term ends in a couple of weeks in the middle of May. We need to get on with this. And I think the thinking is that idea just kind of permeated through eventually to the president, that now they're at a junction where they have to get it done. There's one other point to consider, by the way. If they had not gone ahead, or if they do not go ahead and confirm Mr. Warsh, it would leave the prospect of Mr. Powell remaining on as a temporary chair.
Right.
And that's probably surely not what the White House would want. So I think a confidence of all of these issues just got them to push it over the line. I want to get into that more in just a minute here, but let me bring you in the conversation, Chris, and just ask you to react to what Enda just said there, the fact that we'd heard a bit of bombast from the U.S. Attorney for D.C. earlier in the week that she was going to stick with this. What is your sense of what's changed here, the degree to which the White House, perhaps with some aid from, the chair of the Banking Committee, from Senator Tillis, made this happen?
Well, everything about this investigation has been abnormal. I mean, Pirro launched this investigation without talking to DOJ leadership. Is it possible that you are on mute this morning? It's early. It's early. Have we put our Zoom? Oh, our control room can hear you, so hang on. We're going to try to work it out. We'll go back to Enda. I mean, same question, right? It's kind of exactly the same question. But as we go forward, there's also no guarantee for Powell, if he steps away, if this all happens, if Warsh is confirmed, the DOJ couldn't restart this investigation, right? That's right. Remember, there are several threads in this. So Ms. Pirro's come out and said we're going to drop the DOJ investigation. Wow, that sounds like a big deal on paper. But she also made it clear that she reserves the right to reopen it. And we know that the Inspector General investigation will be very detailed. And of course, the DOJ could seize on something on that on paper and perhaps reopen it. So it doesn't give Mr. Powell much finality, and that's what he's been looking for. Right.
Chris, once more into the Zoom breach. Let's try again here. Have you responded to what I asked you the
first time? We believe in you.
Which is what changed on the part of Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. Attorney for D.C., over the last few days?
Well, everything about this investigation has been abnormal. Pirro started this investigation without talking to anybody at DOJ. She coordinated with Bill Pulte, the head of the Federal Housing Agency, in order to launch it. And then she was sticking to her guns in the face of all this opposition. And even as early as 4 days ago, she was saying that she was committed to the investigation. And then obviously yesterday, she dropped the investigation. And if you look at even, the language she used, she is not willingly doing this. She was clearly leaned on in order to do it. She said that there has been a referral over to the Fed, IG, in order to do the investigation, but she reserves the right to resume the investigation. And it remains to be seen if that's going to satisfy Republican senators like Tom Tillis when she's out there saying that she might resume the investigation.
And we haven't heard from Senator Tillis. He's going to do an interview tomorrow morning on NBC News. We haven't heard from Jerome Powell either. So let me play a bit of tape here of the Fed chair talking a bit about this investigation from last month. Let's take a listen.
I have no intention of leaving the board until the investigation is well and truly over, with transparency and finality. And I would refer you to the statement that was in the Fed's brief that you will all have seen, and I won't have anything more for you on that. On the question of whether I will then continue to serve as a governor after my term ends and after the investigation is over, I have not made that decision yet. And I will make that decision based on what I think is best for the institution and for the people we serve.
I linger on one phrase there, and that is his desire not to leave until the investigation is well and truly over. So here you have the DOJ effectively ending its investigation for now. I guess we can add that caveat to the end of that. But the investigation does continue at the behest of the U.S. Attorney. This now moves over to the IG's office. Will it be enough to satisfy Jay Powell? Does he feel like that investigation is well and truly over?
Well, it's going to be a big judgment call because we know the IG, Inspector General inquiry, will be very detailed. I mean, recently, for example, they put out a report on overspend on laptops at the Federal Reserve that was detailed with prices, with photographs, you name it. So I'd imagine their investigation into multi-billion-dollar renovation is probably going to turn up issues. And the question then becomes, could any of that be used by the DOJ to resurrect the investigation? That's going to be the big call for Chair Powell. Just to be clear, it's unusual for him, while his term as chair ends in mid-May, he's allowed to stay as a governor.
Till 28.
Until the start of 2028. And that's what's kind of unusual in all of this.
Chris, I mean, similar in that vein, Bloomberg opinion columnist Jonathan Levine wrote that Powell should take the win and leave when his term expires. Is there any leverage, any way to get any kind of an immunity deal out of DOJ? I haven't heard any talk about that. I'm assuming that's not on the cards. But what do you think? Should Powell just go gently into that good night, or should he get some guarantees before he gives away his leverage?
Well, I think for Powell, this is a matter of, fundamental principle. And, he feels like that, he's got the upper hand here. And also, I think it's really telling that the investigation was dismissed when Pirro was saying that she had legitimate reasons to look into the cost overruns. And usually the Justice Department isn't going to back down from a criminal investigation when they feel that they have the goods in order to continue. And so the fact that the department decided to back away from the investigation tells you that there was, some failures on the department's part to have the information that would actually result in a fruitful investigation. And so everybody was looking for an off-ramp. And at this point, it looks like that the Justice Department is providing the off-ramp for Powell, and the question is, will he take it?
Chris, we're lucky to have you with us for your perspective on this office, on the U.S. Attorney's Office for D.C. So I think of the major U.S. attorneys now. I think there are a lot of people who know of Jay Clayton. Obviously, he had a big government profile before he took that job in New York in the Southern District. But I think it's safe to say Jeanine Pirro, formerly Judge Jeanine, is best known to the American people. What do we know of how she's running this office, the role that it's playing in the broader Justice Department ecosystem at a time when there is an acting Attorney General? We'll see what happens to Todd Blanche. The role that she has now, talk a bit about that and the platform that she has as the U.S. Attorney for D.C.
Well, I think that Pirro has emerged as one of the most aggressive and effective surrogates for Trump in terms of carrying out his agenda. If you look at the cases that she's been pursuing, she's been very aggressive in terms of pursuing cases that relate to like immigration crackdowns and violent crime crackdowns, but also going after Trump's perceived political enemies. I mean, she was the one that brought the investigation against the Democratic lawmakers who put out the video talking about how military members have an obligation to follow their oath. And that investigation failed when she tried to go before a grand jury. So she's had a number of cases that have been clearly driven by the interest of the president, but she has not been able to succeed in finishing those investigations. And she's had some really significant public failures with some of the efforts that she's made to go into the grand jury and get charges.
I've been speaking to some just friends and acquaintances in D.C. who are lower level prosecutors at DOJ who just talk about the whiplash of not knowing what they're supposed to be working on, if what they work on is then going to get pardoned by the president, who they're supposed to be investigating, and just the shifting sands underneath them. I do want to ask you, though, as we look back on Jay Powell's term at the Fed, what are the big takeaways? What did they do right? What did they do wrong? What did they change? And what is his legacy going to be?
Well, it was a very turbulent time when, if you think about it, he had the pandemic, then he had the great inflation outbreak, and then, of course, he had this political attack by the Trump White House. I think the Fed publicly, Mr. Powell publicly would say that they responded as they needed to during the pandemic, a time of grave economic threat, rolling out all of the support that they did for households and businesses, cutting down interest rates and putting money into the money markets to try and keep things ticking over. So they would stand by that. Of course, the criticism has been that they were very slow to respond to inflation. I remember at the time they were calling it transitory. And of course, that left a legacy now of price burn in people's pockets for years since. So the inflation story is there. And then when it comes to the battle against Trump for protecting Fed independence, I think on that one he's come across as being seen as firm and resolute in trying to stand up for the institution against political pressure. So like anyone, it's clearly a mixed legacy. He has some supporters and some fans.
Enda Curran, great to see you. Thank you very much for coming in on this Saturday morning. Enda Curran, who covers the Fed for us here at Bloomberg News, and Chris Trump, who covers the Justice Department. Great to get your perspective on this story that's very much still evolving over the course of this weekend. As I say, Senator Tom Till is scheduled to be on NBC tomorrow, and I think he is the one that we are waiting to hear from Christina.
That's the interview to tune in. We will be monitoring that as well while we're live on air here.
Is Jay Powell satisfied? Yes. Is Senator Till satisfied? That's going to make a host of difference here, looking ahead to that confirmation of Kevin Warsh.
100%.
All right, coming up here, Elon Musk, the world's richest man, on track to add to his fortune this year when SpaceX goes public. Up next, we're going to speak to the authors of a new book that looks at Musk's past. What might happen next? They've coined a new neologism here, Muskism, about the role that Elon Musk is playing in the world and all of our lives. That's coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, streaming, of course, at Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg Business app. Stay with us.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. iHeartMedia reportedly holding talks about a possible sale to SiriusXM. Sources say the deal would create an audio giant, joining the largest radio station owner in the U.S. with the largest satellite radio service. At the combined company, it would have more than $12 billion in sales. Bloomberg Radio provides programming to SiriusXM satellite radio. iHeartMedia is a strategic partner of Bloomberg Media. And sources tell Bloomberg the Trump administration is weighing whether to invoke the Defense Production Act to support a potential bailout of Spirit Aviation. The 1950 law gives the U.S. president emergency powers to direct production of goods and services that are critical to national defense, and that includes extending loans and making investments. Now, applying to a statute to a commercial airline, that would likely face some legal and political scrutiny. And the hottest phone for kids right now is a $100 retro-styled landline. You heard that right. The tin can, it lets people make free calls between devices, also to emergency services. It's gone viral over the last 12 months. Hundreds of thousands have been sold. Parents say their kids get excited to use it, and they get excited to keep them away from social media.
I am a skeptic of this.
You don't have one of these? Our executive producer just said in our ear she has one of these.
There's also a waiting list to get it. And I think like, when I talk to my kids, like they are terrible on the phone, meaning like I think kids today are not conditioned to like pick up the phone and talk. They're used to FaceTime. But like, what are they going to talk about? What are these young kids going to talk about? I didn't have a phone. They'll call 911 is what the EP is saying. Thank you very much.
Gosh,
Carolyn,
there you go.
That's true. Really bring it down to the realities that, yes, they could call 911. I guess that's important.
If I get one of those, I don't want you on the other line. I want Lisa on the other line.
All right.
Good for you. All right, the world's richest man may soon also be the world's first trillionaire, as Elon Musk's SpaceX targets an initial public offering with a valuation around $1.5 trillion in what would be the largest IPO ever.
Our next guests are the authors of a new book called Muskism, a guide for the perplexed, and that neologism, that term refers to the ideology and worldview that shaped Musk. They say it is an operating system for the 21st century. Ben Tarnoff joins us now, along with Quinn Slobodian. Ben, let me start with you. And just have you define this term. I mentioned it's a new one. What is Muskism, and how important is it to all of us in the way in which we lead our lives today?
So we define Muskism as the promise of sovereignty through technology. And the case we make throughout our book is that Musk is not so much in the business of selling cars, rockets, or satellites, so much as he sells the idea that in an increasingly unstable world, both individuals and nation states can fortify their self-reliance and resilience by plugging into his infrastructures. But of course, in doing so, they become even more dependent on his infrastructures. And you can really see this as a through line throughout his career. Take the example of SpaceX, which gets its start in the early years of the War on Terror as a key government contractor, helping Donald Rumsfeld's Pentagon put satellites into space. Now, 20 years later, Starlink is the main revenue model for SpaceX. And when you look at Starlink's major use cases, it's military, it's also first responders, public safety who need to be operating in remote environments and also in times of conventional grid failure. So we really see this as a through line throughout Musk's career.
Quinn, you guys also compare Musk to Fordism. Henry Ford, assembly line techniques, standardization absolutely changed manufacturing and ushered in this system of mass production that still kind of defines American capitalism and especially defined the 20th century capitalism. When you compare that to Elon Musk, where are they similar? Where are they separate? And is Elon Musk the Henry Ford of the 21st century?
Yeah, thanks for having us. Fordism is a term that was coined about exactly 100 years ago. And people were not just talking about the factory, but they're talking about the world outside the factory, right? So it was a world of mass production plus mass consumption, in which doing things on the assembly line was also about the nuclear family. It was about intergenerational upward mobility. It was about collective bargaining agreements. So there's a kind of social contract inside of Fordism that was very interesting to us because we wanted to ask, if you look at Musk, what's his social contract, right? We know that he has his group of reply guys who can even monetize their feed. We know he has investors who are very interested in his businesses. But how do you scale that? Is it possible to build something as stable as the 20th century model, in which there was a kind of a virtuous cycle of workers being able to afford the products, when, as Musk is doing, you're kind of promising to make a lot of those workers obsolete? And you seem to have a very selective idea of who gets to be in the social contract and who gets to be out. So the way that Fordism has been described as a kind of philosophy of social peace, we think of one of the strange things about Musk is he seems to be preaching a kind of ideology of social war. He almost seems to be drumming up kind of antagonisms and frictions as a way to better sell those insulating technologies to make you safe inside of your Tesla or SpaceX dome, you know, when the social unrest begins, when climate breakdown begins. So it's a very tenuous kind of social contract we see. And in the last chapter of the book, we talk about Doge and State X as a kind of way to test the theory. Like, can Musk become a real techno king, as he is officially described at Tesla? Or do normal politicians like Trump actually still have an important role to play in the model? How far can Silicon Valley govern directly?
But let me stay with that, because I think there's been a lot of fascination about Elon Musk's engagement with politics, and you write about state symbiosis in the book. That is, we have Elon Musk presenting himself as a real libertarian, doing things outside the realm of government, and yet we've seen him obviously cozy up to this president. I don't know what the state of the relationship is, what the state of the relationship is today, but drill in on that if you could, the way that he sees his companies, his empire interfacing with government.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anything we were trying to do with the book was to really change the conversation specifically around this. So we really think that the notion that Musk, or really anyone in Silicon Valley in the leadership class, is a libertarian is really kind of a misleading, almost a red herring. Certainly someone like Peter Thiel had his moment when he preached that kind of ideology, but Musk actually never did. What's actually fascinating about following Musk's career from the 90s, when he starts a company called Zip2, few people remember, which relies on what? The new government developed service of GPS. That was military technology, and he taps into that and makes that a commercial facing product. SpaceX, Tesla, Department of Energy loans, zero emission vehicle credits. He's always actually been happy and open about using the backstop of the state, thinking about the government as a primary client. And in this era of generative AI becoming really the investment story and the growth story for the tech sector, you can't live without the government, right? You need a friendly state. You need someone who's going to open up federal land for data center construction, who's going to clear the path in regulatory terms for you to get your way. So in fact, we don't see a contradiction when Musk enters government. We see it as a kind of a test of how far the state symbiotic relationship can go without becoming a parasitic one. So Musk works when he works because he actually increases the capacity of states to do things. When it tips over into parasitism, then it becomes a kind of obstructing crony-style capitalism, and it stops working for both partners, as we've seen, indeed, many times in the Musk-Trump relationship.
Ben, we've only got a little over a minute left, but I also want to ask you about the cult of the Musk personality and the whole ethos around him and how that's folded in with the political climate and how that's impacted everything we've just talked about. Can Elon Musk, the businessman, exist without the other half of that? Do they feed each other or do they conflict with each other?
Well, one way to think about this question is Musk's relationship to science fiction. I think a lot of commentators, observers of Musk have noticed that he often cites science fiction as a major influence. We actually see Musk as a science fiction author or narrator of a sort, because from the beginning, from the 1990s, when he makes his first fortune as a dot-com entrepreneur, he's very good at securing investor confidence by telling stories about the future. And these future stories are on the one hand fantastical, but on the other hand have a kernel of plausibility such that investors are willing to help give him the money to go build that future. We actually describe this dynamic as financial fabulism. And over the years, he finds new venues, new forums for this financial fabulism. Social media arguably supercharges it, where he can speak to not just institutional investors, but he can move markets with memes. He can post about Dogecoin, the cryptocurrency, and the price of Dogecoin goes up. He can post about Tesla and the price of Tesla goes up. So that has become so integral to his business that it's infrastructure, essentially.
Ben Tarnoff, thank you very much. Ben Tarnoff, Quinn, Slobodian, the authors of Muskism, a new book on store shelves now.
Thank you both so much. Coming up, dozens of world leaders coming together on the tiny island of Cyprus this week with the safety of Europe and NATO very much on their minds. Oliver Crook joins us next from Cyprus to talk about all that and much more. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini, here, of course, with David Gura. The war in Iran and the impact on global energy supplies and the security of NATO dominated a meeting this week in Cyprus among EU nations.
There were some notable absences at that conference on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent Oliver Crook has been there for all of the proceedings. Oliver, let's start there if we could. We know that President Zelensky was there. We know that the president of Syria made an appearance as well. Who was absent? What does that say about Europe's focus at this point in time?
Yeah. Well, one of the sort of notable absences was Viktor Orban, right? He has been voted out as prime minister of Hungary. That was a couple of weeks ago. And of course, that has sort of shaped very fundamentally the power dynamic at the table of the European Council, where all the leaders were assembled to discuss the various different issues that are facing Europe right now. And once again, the tone and the sort of conversation being set by Donald Trump and the activity in Iran, obviously the energy crisis. But again, the absence of Viktor Orban, and we had to sort of nod to this from the Polish prime minister, Donald Tusk, who said for the very first time in a very long time at the European Council table, Russia was not present, which was a sort of dig at Viktor Orban and his close ties to Vladimir Putin. But when you think about Zelensky, who was there on Thursday night meeting with leaders, he has had a really spectacular reversal of fate over the last couple of weeks. A couple of weeks ago, it was unclear whether or not the Europeans were going to be able to get him that 90 billion euro loan. That is absolutely fundamental. That's really a survival lifeline for the Ukrainians to fund the war effort for the next 2 years. That has shifted. They also got through the 20th sanction package. They're now working on the 21st sanction package. These are European sanctions over on the Russians. And now there's a very active conversation at the European level, now that Viktor Orban is out, about the process of bringing the Ukraine into the European Union, the accession talks. That is something that the Ukrainians would like to see happen as soon as next year. That is intensely optimistic in terms of a timeline. But there were real conversations and real concerns about this being a real conversation and sort of being able to make any progress while Viktor Orban was there. And this is something that is now being discussed at this highest level for the Europeans. We should say it's still a pretty long path for the Ukrainians to join, but it's absolutely symbolically and, of course, economically vital for them and their future.
That's some pretty direct diplomatic shade. Russia not present. That's kind of as shady as you get in those circles. The other thing I've been hearing a lot of sound on, and I know you flagged some sound from the Romanian president about, is there was this Reuters report about an internal Pentagon memo talking about how the president might be looking into trying to suspend Spain and other members who aren't helping with Iran. even going so far as to talking about the Falkland Islands, possibly seeing if they could change sides and say that the British don't get the Falkland Islands anymore. We do want to play you flag this sound from the Romanian president, and then I'll come back to you.
Inside the European Union, we are one of the biggest supporters of the transatlantic relation, because we understand that our security, the Europe security, depends a lot on NATO and directly on the United States. Of course, so you know all the context. For years there was a disbalance between the expenses for the security between the United States and Europe.
So, Oliver, that's from your interview. Why did you want to talk to him, and why does Romania stand out as we talk about how Europe is responding to the conflicts in the Middle East right now?
Yeah, so I mean, Romania is one of the only EU nations that actually allowed the United States to use their bases for refueling and other sort of operational tasks in their bombing campaign and their war in Iran, which was something that really sort of is an outlier within Europe. Again, the Europeans keep being put in these sort of impossible positions by the president of the United States, where on the one hand, basically their survival from a security standpoint, Article 5 of NATO, is so dependent on having the United States remaining bought in on NATO, while at the same time really not wanting to become a party to the war in Iran. So Romania really sort of stuck as a sort of very interesting sort of example there. And I asked him, we're talking now about Trump possibly reprisals on NATO. Are you thinking that maybe you can get some rewards now from the Trump administration for having helped them? And he said that, listen, that they've been building their economic relationship for a very long time. He did say that American companies in the conversations they've had recently will be now more involved in Romania and sort of extracting oil and gas. But going back to this idea of the reprisals for these NATO nations and European countries that did not help the United States. I mean, Donald Trump has really sort of oscillated quite wildly. On the one hand, saying that NATO should be involved on the strikes or in some way in the military operation. On the other, saying that they don't need the help. But this email that is apparently circulating, reported by Reuters, that the United States is thinking about finding ways to suspend or kick Spain out of NATO, ostensibly because, of course, Spain did not allow the base use, but also because they're the only nation within NATO who is not committed to paying that 5% of GDP to defense.
Ollie, last question is just about the vibes of this conference, and I'm curious how much unanimity there is. You mentioned Viktor Orban not there. I don't think that his successor was there either. But how much does that kind of change the tenor of an event like this one as Europe talks about doing more to defend itself, perhaps without the U.S.'s aid in the way that it has in the past? What was the feel at this conference?
Yeah, I think it changes the tenor pretty dramatically, David. I mean, we think about Viktor Orban has really been the thorn in the side, and a lot of people in other nations have hidden behind Viktor Orban because he was brash enough and bold enough to basically say no to stuff. But there's another point that's also made. It was made by the Belgian prime minister that basically the euphoria over Peter Magyar and the sort of new regime within Hungary may be a little bit overblown, that things may not be just sort of full unanimity going forward, that actually some of the opinions that Viktor Orban held were shared in some ways by some of the other European member states. And we should say that there was also an election in Bulgaria last week. You had a sort of more pro-Kremlin figure that was sort of elected there. And so you have these vacillations, particularly in Eastern Europe, between these sort of very pro-EU governments and these sort of less pro-EU governments. So I don't think that it's sort of a closed question in dealing with some of these questions. But I do think that Viktor Orban, symbolically, after 16 years being out, really makes a big difference in terms of getting some of these initiatives over the line, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. And you can feel it really from Zelensky while he was there over the last 24 hours.
Olive branches, both metaphorical and literal, as we see behind Oliver Crook there, joining us from Cyprus on this Saturday. Oliver, thank you very much.
You're so proud of that.
I was, yeah.
You're so proud of that. He said, I'm going to thank. And I was like, okay, that was why. All right, we're coming up on 8 a.m. in Washington.
And we're going to have Dan Yergin, the vice chair of S&P Global, joining us to talk about energy markets up next on Bloomberg This Weekend, which starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. and we are live from Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios. I'm David Gura with Christina Ruffini and Lisa Mateo. We are here for the White House Correspondents Association dinner.
That's right.
But a lot unfolding in terms of real news as well.
It's interesting because everyone is here for the dinner, but it's helpful because there's so much news and we get to talk to all our colleagues in person and kind of pick their brains in between, putting on uncomfortable dresses.
We talked about this last hour, roaming around here. Then this news breaks about Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve. So that's certainly animating a lot of conversations that we've been having here over the course of the last 24, 36 hours.
And also people are waiting to see what the president is going to do. He's never gone to this dinner before.
Proudly protested and not gone to in the
Proudly
past.
Protested. I was wrong. I said I didn't think he was going to show up, but he's coming, and we'll have to see what he says if he makes some news and how he feels about all the people seated in that ballroom.
Yes, and how they indeed react to what the president has to say. Let's start here with the headlines. Lisa Mateo joining us here in Washington. Lisa.
You got it. Well, the White House says a special envoy intends to meet with Iranian officials in Pakistan this weekend to try and end the more than 8-week war. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
The president has decided to dispatch Special Envoy Witkoff and Jared Kushner back to Islamabad. The Iranians want to talk. They want to talk in person. And so the president is, as I've said many, many times to all of you, always willing to give diplomacy a chance.
Meanwhile, Iran's top diplomat landed in Pakistan. A spokesperson for Iran's foreign ministry said he will meet only with Pakistani officials, with no talks planned with the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, the lead negotiator for the U.S., will not be headed to Pakistan for now. Well, this all comes as the U.S. increased pressure on Iran with its naval blockade, while Israel and Lebanon are set to extend a ceasefire for 3 weeks. President Donald Trump ordered the U.S. Navy to shoot any boat putting mines into the Strait of Hormuz after the military intercepted 2 oil supertankers that tried to evade restrictions on traffic to and from Iran's ports. Now to the war in Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia carried out one of the largest attacks on Ukraine overnight, killing 4 people, leaving over 30 wounded across the country. Ukraine's general staff said Russia launched nearly 50 ballistic missiles and more than 600 drones. And in other news, the Justice Department said it will allow executions by firing squad and restore the use of lethal injections in federal death penalty cases. The Trump administration has been moving to ramp up and expedite capital punishment cases. And U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro, she is dropping her investigation into Fed J. Powell in relation to building the renovation costs overruns by the central bank. Now, it was in his social media post. Pirro said that the Fed's inspector general is going to look into that and that she will restart a criminal investigation if their report calls for it. House Financial Services Committee Chairman French Hill says it's a step in the right direction.
The accusation that Chairman Powell had committed some sort of crime connected with the building construction, or his testimony about it, was a distraction, and that it would delay President Trump in the selection of a high-quality new chair for the Fed and the important economic policy that should be coordinated between the Fed, the U.S. Treasury, the legislative branch.
Now, Hill added that he hopes the move will prompt the quick confirmation of Kevin Warsh. Jay Powell's term is set to expire on May 15th. David and Christina.
Thank you very much. Just fascinating to see sort of how Tom Tillis of North Carolina is going to respond to this and how the Fed chair himself will respond to this move of the investigation from the Justice Department to the IG's office.
Right. As you mentioned earlier, there's 2 questions. Is it enough for Jay Powell and is it enough for Tom Tillis? And we're going to have to see.
Yes. Well, let's get you up to speed on what's happening at this very moment in Pakistan. Iran's foreign minister is in a meeting in Islamabad with Pakistan's prime minister. We are waiting to see what happens later today when Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and Steve Witkoff, the president's envoy for the Middle East, are scheduled to make their way to Pakistan, despite the fact that Iran continues to say no meeting is planned between these two sides, between Iran and the United States.
Covering all of this and traveling with the president in Florida is Bloomberg senior White House correspondent Josh Wingrove. Josh, as we look ahead at what could or could not be happening in Pakistan, I want to go back to something we were talking to you about in the last hour, and that's the president's interest level to endure this as this seems to drag out. We heard our Middle East colleagues say people in the Gulf are assuming this could take up to 6 months to resolve. There doesn't seem to be a lot of urgency if these talks go. It's unlikely that they're going to produce an outcome in the next week or weeks to come. What does this mean for the White House? And if the president kind of dials out, could this be the state of play for quite some time, especially in the Strait?
I mean, I think if they are in 6 months from now still in a similar situation to today with like potential, attacks at any moment, I think that is not the American vision of this. Trump has teased the prospect of beginning attacks on Iran, saying that they've hit 75% of their targets and are prepared to hit the other 25%. I cannot imagine he wants to be in an active conflict, getting ever closer to those midterms, but we'll see. Since we spoke last hour, we are getting radio silence from the administration so far still on if and when Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have departed for Pakistan and what the president's expectations are for these talks. And we'll just continue, I guess, to have to wait and see. Remember, the blockade is a tricky one. Trump declaring we have total control in the Strait. Well, not really. I mean, they have total control over the shutter of the Strait in that they are also shuttering it. But what he wanted was, of course, the opposite. And it does not appear that the U.S. has control over that. And that is going to be frustrating and is sort of the big question hanging over all of this for the president.
Where we have gotten some information in the last 24 hours is from the Pentagon, and we had the Defense Secretary briefing reporters yesterday alongside the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. Let's play a little bit of tape from Pete Hegseth talking to reporters yesterday about the state of that blockade in the Middle East.
Is the blockade growing? In fact, a second aircraft carrier will join the blockade in just a few days, but this growing blockade is also gone global. Just this week, we seized 2 Iranian dark fleet ships in the Indo-Pacific region that had left Iranian ports before the blockade went into effect.
Josh, there have been times when the Pentagon and the White House haven't been singing from the same hymn sheet, to use that phrase. Are they now in sync? And what did you learn yesterday from that briefing from the Defense Secretary?
I mean, I think so. They're just trying to project operational, dominance in the region to try to regain the upper hand. It's just not clear that they have it. And so right now, I think the question is more, what is Iran seeking other than that blockade? Because again, the president has sort of drawn a line in the sand a little bit to say, well, I don't want to lift the blockade until we have a deal. And that is really the sort of fundamental impasse that we have at this point. I should note, members of Congress, including top Republicans, continue to not be all that perturbed, or at least not publicly perturbed about how this is playing out. And that has historically been a pressure point for the president, as has the market reaction. I think one thing that's kind of slipped under the radar a couple of days ago was the president saying that he expected, of course, the market reaction to be worse. We've seen markets recover the losses after this attack, but also that he expected the potential for $200 oil. In other words, we have not gotten anywhere near that. So he's saying, look, the market fallout hasn't been all that bad. I found that number interesting because Bloomberg had scooped previously the $200 oil was something that the administration was gaming out. They denied it on the record, and there was the president saying it publicly that, yeah, in fact, he was worried about that. So I think, we're looking at, for instance, the Spirit Airlines thing. What's Trump doing? Well, he probably is looking at Intel Corp. Think it worked out for him. Right now, the president probably is looking at this, me guesstimating where he's at, saying the market fallout hasn't been as bad. The price of gas hasn't been as bad. Maybe I have a little more runway. And I think that is an important dynamic hanging over him politically as he looks at the landscape here.
All right, Josh Wingrove, live from West Palm. Thank you for getting up for us, and hopefully you'll make it all the way back to D.C. tonight. We'll see you at the dinner.
All right. Joining us now in studio, Vice Admiral Kevin Donegan. He's a former director of Navy Staff and commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, now a distinguished military fellow for the Middle East Institute here in Washington. Admiral, thank you very much for being here. Let's start with this blockade and how you see the utility of it at this point in time. We know from conversations about the diplomatic side of things, this is a real sticking point for the Iranians. They're not thrilled, to say the least, that this blockade remains. And as we heard from the Secretary yesterday, the U.S. is augmenting it still. What role is it playing, and is it playing one that maybe is slowing down or making more difficult these diplomatic negotiations?
Well, it's doing both, actually. It's, you should look at this, I think we should look at this through the lens of, right now, 2 things, leverage and time. Right, you just covered time, and does the president have time? How long can it last? Iranians have to look at it the same way, and the leverage in play is from the U.S. side after the ceasefire has been this blockade. On the Iranian side, it's to show they continue to control the straits, and you're seeing those both play out. And so, what's the impact? Is clearly we've seen the numbers of ships. Right, 34 ships have turned around, and remember the U.S. blockade isn't on the Straits of Hormuz. It's to keep anything from flowing into Iran or out. And the idea is they've been getting a pass during the rest of the conflict and letting their oil come out and getting money from that, and just their economy. And when you look at it, 90% of their revenue that Iran gets comes from seaborne trade. So the blockade has an impact, but it's not instant. Each day that builds more and more, and there's different estimates, but you're talking about $400 million-ish a day in impact to the Iranian economy. So this is why time is important for anything, but especially for a blockade, because that builds over time. And when you compound that with that the Iranians had 50% inflation before the conflict started, that their steel industry was decimated, that their internet's been turned off, and the complications they just have with their people. But as we've seen before, the Iranian leadership's concern isn't necessarily with the people. We saw that in the protests. They're willing to hang on. So in reality, how does this time thing play out? Do they continue to let the blockade? Do the Iranians want to continue to endure this blockade? Are they going to come to the table with something that President Trump can agree with?
Well, I want to follow up on that because you were talking about how much it's costing Iran, but it's not free for the U.S. either. And as Hegseth said, we're going to expand it. There's another carrier headed there. And if we look at a prolonged, protracted conflict, the U.S. does not have a good history in wars of attrition or wars of insurgency or against entrenched populations who have nothing left to lose. So if it comes down to a waiting game, who wins that out?
Yeah, so you're really talking about what's the patience on the U.S. side, right? So what's clear, though, is the U.S. is posturing, though, as if they're not going to quit soon, right? You saw that they just moved another aircraft carrier strike group to the region. That's just to say that if we go back to strikes, which is one of our options, we have the forces necessary to do that. And they certainly have the forces in place to do this blockade. I think that commitment and forces is made now. I don't think you're going to see a backing out of the blockade. It would take all the pressure off. And then also add it, remember that the Iranians have $100 billion of their assets frozen along with sanctions. So, we'll have to see if this blockade does have an effect. It will over time, clearly. But, are the Iranian leadership just going to suffer through this thinking that they'll outlast the United States will?
Talk to us about the psychology of navigating the Strait in the middle of this conflict or as it ends. And the U.S. is determined to get passage opened up once again in a safe way. But there is this fear of there being drones or mines or these smaller boats. What's it going to take to assuage those who are worried about navigating a vessel through the Strait? How do you know to a degree of certainty that you can get a ship through the Strait without hitting a mine or some other difficulty?
Well, right now we see that the Straits, Iran can let ships pass
through a narrow part of it,
but they're going not through the main channels. There's normally like a highway there where
I didn't know this until this conflict, but they usually go this way and now they're going this way, right?
Yeah, normally you go straight through the middle and you stay to the right, and when you come out you stay to the right. So it's like a highway, but it's very clear on navigational charts, and that allows a lot of throughput. What Iran said is, we've mined that area in the middle. You have to now come closer to our islands so they can run their small boats out. So what's going to assuage the shipping companies, even when this ends, is the Strait clear of mines, which you've heard the U.S. is even to this day working on identifying and clearing mines there, and then our insurance rate's going to get low enough, and that's going to mean that they're not going to be worried about Iran attacking them, because we do have a lot of ships that are still stuck inside the Gulf that are not coming out until they know that their crews are going to be safe and that their ships are going to be safe. This is why the president's been asking other countries to make sure, try to enlist their support in the end in ensuring and helping with any mine clearance that's needed to assuage those mariners that it is safe to travel. I really think, though, the key is an agreement where the Iranians said, we're not going to do anything to ships, and then the mine clearance becomes something that can be done administratively, not under the pressure of further attacks. And they can clear a small strait relatively quickly, a small passage area through the middle, and then widen that over time.
Even if they manage to do that, and if the Strait becomes nominally open, if you were asked to consult for Maersk or one of these other big shipping companies, or a captain called you and said, do you think it's safe for me to take my crew through this strait? Would you say yes or no?
Well, right now, clearly they're voting no, right? And afterwards, I think it's all going to depend on what they hear from the negotiating table. My sense is if there is a negotiated settlement, they're going to say yes, and they're going to watch and see that yes, there's no mines there, and the U.S. gives assurances, and the international community gives assurance there's no mines, and then I think you're going to see them resume. But that doesn't instantly get all that cargo to all the ports that they were going to.
No.
There's a time lag in all that, and there's other experts that can talk about that. But at least, like you said, I do think that one of the things that is somewhat surprising is the price of oil isn't as high as everyone would thought it had been with the
as Josh was just talking about.
So that is in essence giving at least the president and the global community a little bit more time than they maybe would have had there not been this much resilience in that energy market.
Got about a minute left, but I want to ask you about the legacy of this. And our colleague Michelle Hussein was sitting down with Ambassador Wendy Sherman, the former Undersecretary of State, talking about the fact that now that this has happened, Iran has pulled this off. There's going to be a legacy to that. There's going to be a global fear that this could happen once again. How do you think about that, the case that Iran has proved in doing this and what it means going forward, even after this conflict gets resolved?
I think we saw the beginning of this when the Houthis closed the Red Sea, right? You had a non-nation state saying, attacking ships in an international waterway, right? And we saw that was detrimental. But we were able to go around Africa, and the supply chain was able to adjust. You don't have that option here, and there's other passages in the world where you don't have that option, where going around is not so easy. What we don't want when this is over is a change to the order that says one nation who lives on one side of an international waterway can charge a toll or obstruct the free flow of commerce. So I think it's what happens here has ramifications globally, not just in the region.
All right, Admiral Donegan, thank you so much for joining us early on a Saturday. We appreciate you.
You flagged this to me earlier, the challenges of them extracting this toll from vessels that they've been doing with cryptocurrency, and there have been reports of scams that people thought they were paying the toll.
Credit to my brother, he flagged this. Yeah, people have thought they've been contacted by something that seemed official. They were told they have to pay a toll and fill out paperwork, and they submitted it, and it actually wasn't Iran. And when they got to the checkpoint, they got boarded and told they hadn't paid the toll. They've been scammed. Crypto scammers are contacting these vessels claiming to be Iran, asking for a big payment. These ships are paying it, and it turns out that it's a very clever and apparently very convincing scam. So there are now warnings going out from Maersk and other companies saying, don't fall for this. It's not real. It's not really the toll.
Bit of breaking news, I see.
Yeah, we've got the Senate Banking Committee has just announced it will hold a vote on Wednesday of next week on the confirmation of Kevin Warsh for Fed chair. This comes less than a day after the Department of Justice dropped its criminal investigation into Jerome Powell.
We'll track that over the course of this morning. Coming up next, Dan Yergin is going to join us. I suspect we'll talk about that prospect of $200 oil.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. Residents in a town north of Oklahoma City, they are digging through what's left after violent tornadoes damaged about 40 homes. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt said no lives were lost and thanked communities for coming together.
Just heart goes out to these folks, and we'll do whatever we can. The Oklahoma standard will be in display as neighbors help neighbors, and we come together.
The National Weather Service says the EF4 tornado was on the ground for 9 miles, packing winds of 170 to 175 miles per hour. Now, from tornadoes to fires in southeast Georgia, more than 120 homes, they've been destroyed, while thousands more remain threatened by 2 large blazes. Investigators believe one of the fires was sparked by a foil balloon touching power lines. In company news, NVIDIA extended its lead as the world's most valuable company. Shares rose to their first record in months on Friday, pushing its market cap to more than $5 trillion. Expectations that massive spending on AI computing infrastructure, well, that continues to drive the rally. And Ford has denied a news report that it's held talks with Geely Automobile Holdings about bringing Chinese car technology to the U.S. market. A Ford spokesperson tells Bloomberg no such discussions have happened with any Chinese car maker about technology sharing or platform sharing in the U.S. Christina and David.
Interesting. I'm having car show flashbacks there.
Yes, you went with Matt Miller.
Me and Matt Miller.
Quite jealous of that.
See what happens when you're on vacation? We go do fun things. All right. Global oil prices have climbed back towards their wartime high as the conflict in Iran hits the 8th week. But have we seen the worst of the sticker shock when it comes to energy prices?
With us now in studio is Dan Yergin, Vice Chairman of S&P Global. He is also the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power, and a new book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Dan, great to have you with us once again, and I want to pick up with what our colleague Josh Wingrove was saying just a moment ago. He's in West Palm Beach with the president. We talked about this notion of kind of energy price relativism, that the president seems perhaps pleasantly surprised that oil prices haven't climbed as much as maybe he feared they would, raising the specter of $200 a barrel oil. Oil prices are higher, but we're not at 2008 prices, for instance. What do you make of what he's talking about there, the fact that the Spike has been sizable, but maybe not as bad as he and others might have feared.
I think that's true. If you go back to the 2008 or 2012 to 14, prices were over $100 a barrel. If you put that in today's dollars, that's like $160 a barrel. So we haven't seen that, and there wasn't that same kind of disruption that we're seeing now. But the question is still the relative calm before the storm? The longer this goes on, the more the risk on the upside grow, because the impacts are being felt. The last cargoes have arrived in Europe, in Asia, and inventories are being drawn down.
Is that what we're waiting for? Because my question is, why isn't it that bad? I'm confounded as a foreign policy person about the markets and their resilience and how any sign of life from these negotiations from the White House, they seem to look for any shred of evidence that things are going to be okay. Why is that happening?
Well, you see a divergence between the financial markets, which, as you say, respond to the news, a deal is near or they're going to negotiate, and the reality of people in Asia actually not having enough oil, shortages, rationing, businesses closing down, restaurants not operating because they don't have energy. So Asia is one area. Europe is starting to feel it, particularly jet fuel, and we're seeing it at the gasoline pump, but it's been there before.
Talk a bit more about that, the pain that many people around the world are feeling. And yes, we're fixated on the market price and futures and all of that, but there's a very real cost that's already taking effect here. And I'm curious sort of how you assess that level of pain.
I think I think one of the things that people didn't think about before this happened, if they thought about the Strait of Hormuz, they thought about oil. Maybe they thought about natural gas and LNG. They didn't think about fertilizer. They didn't think about helium. They didn't think about aluminum. They didn't think about petrochemicals. And it turned out that region is much more integrated into the global economy because of all the economic development there. So it produces, about 30-40% of the world's helium, which you need to make semiconductors or MRI machines. So this is actually, unlike all the other things we were talking about in the last 20 years, this is a much bigger disruption of the global economy. But it's Asia, because basically, economically, the Strait of Hormuz went east. 80% of the oil, 90% of the LNG went to Asia, and that's where the shortfall is, in ways that people really didn't model.
I saw Fatih Birol of the International Energy Agency saying we are facing the biggest energy security threat in history. And I wonder if you agree with that assessment of the moment that we're in. I'm very curious what Dan Yergin's perspective is on this moment in the wider sweep of history.
Yeah, I think this is the biggest energy disruption we've ever seen. But as you say, it's ironic that we're not seeing the full price impact. And so time is really the key factor here.
When you look at this, is it so bad because geographically there's just really no alternative, as there have been in some other conflicts? Obviously there are pipelines that go out to the Red Sea, but you just can't get that volume through anywhere else. And as we've also been talking about, how concerned are you that this could be a chronic problem? Just because Iran agrees to something in the room doesn't mean they're going to change their minds if they've shown they have the capacity to shut this down.
Yeah, there was, until this happened, there was a thing called the TSS, the traffic separator system, where people understood that, okay, in an orderly way, this goes this way, this goes this way. Now there's going to be uncertainty over it, and it raises questions not only about the Strait, but it raises the question about freedom of seas on which the world economy and world trade really depends. So I think we come out of this, there's going to be an uneasiness about it, and so much will be critical as to what the outcome will be. Will there be an actual system and understanding of how this operates, or is it something that will fluctuate?
We last spoke with you 8 weeks ago, I think, at the beginning of this conflict. Yes, and it was on the eve of
it was 8 weeks ago. I feel like you were just here. Okay, sorry, continue.
You are on the eve of going to run your conference in Texas, CERAWeek, and I'm very curious, with that in the rearview mirror, what those conversations were like. I imagine that your agenda had to be adjusted and changed as a result of what was happening in the Middle East, but what were the conversations like among executives that you had on stage and indeed had on the sidelines about this conflict?
I think there were two things. One goes to what we were talking about, which is the sense that the market was underpricing risk the longer it goes on. And I think that was a very strong message. And from the company people, you heard they were focused on constraints, logistics, how do you get supplies, how do you make up for supplies? So they were not looking at what the futures markets were doing, expectations. They were saying, how do we deliver oil? The other big thing, of course, the theme of the conference was big tech meets the energy industry. Where are you going to get the electricity for all the AI development, and what will be the sources? And so that was the theme that was in place before the crisis. But you could see really when it was in late January when the military buildup started, and that prices were already rising before the war started.
So what is the solution for that? I mean, as we talk about big tech, data centers, this sudden spike in requirement coming at the same time there is an energy crunch. Green energy is not very popular right now. Alternatives are not very popular right now. Is that something that needs to be reevaluated? Do they need to reevaluate how they move this oil through the region? Is anyone talking about an alternative long-term plan so that we're not dealing with this every few years if this happens again and again?
Well, I think that out of this is going to come a bigger focus on energy security, and the Gulf countries themselves are going to say, what do we do to protect ourselves? What do we do in terms of investment within the Gulf and outside the Gulf? But I think that, this is the first, we're in the China EV era. 20% of the cars built in the world this year will be EVs, and that's going to get a tick up from this, certainly.
In our last block, we talked about the blockade, the utility of it, the degree it's weighing on negotiations that are unfolding. And I know that there's been some debate about what the presence of that blockade, the Strait being effectively closed, is going to mean for oil prices going forward. We have the President of the United States saying, and I'm going to paraphrase him here, he's got all the time in the world. If that blockade persists, if we see the kind of stalemate that we have been seeing for 3 months or 6 months or whatever, what is the effect that's going to have here?
Well, of course, sitting here, it's hard to believe that it will last for another 3 months or 6 months, but a lot's happened that this was all war was going to be over in 5 days. I think there are two things. One is a question and the leverage point about how bad is the Iranian economy? How much strain can it take without the resources? And that's the bet of the U.S. blockade. I think the Iranian blockade, which it basically is that they can wage war on the world economy and the pressure will be so great that they'll come out in a better position. And in a sense, it's a clash between these two blockades that's unfolding now.
We haven't talked about, on this point, we haven't talked about Karg Island in many weeks now, but that was something that was kind of looming as something the U.S. might do, try to take Karg Island or destroy Karg Island. Play out that scenario for us here, too. If things really go south in Islamabad, if there isn't any advancement in these talks, and President Trump, as he says, he will pursue his military action once again, targeting power plants and infrastructure and perhaps the refining capabilities of Karg Island. What does that mean?
Well, Winston Churchill said once that once the war starts, what happens, whatever your plan is, what happens is unforeseeable and uncontrollable, and we're sort of in that state right now. I think Karg Island, as I understand, it's doable, but it's also very vulnerable from the shore because it's fairly close in, and our Iranian artillery and drones and so forth. I think one of the factors here that is new is that really the new form of warfare that was really beta tested in Ukraine is now being played out in the Gulf region, and that would affect decisions about Karg Island.
These are the cheap drones and
cheap drones.
And we were talking about, it's been fascinating to see this pivot for Vladimir Zelensky, who's had a good run of luck with Orban being ousted in Hungary and getting new allies in the Gulf as he's in Saudi and visiting the region and trying
to paraphrase, he has some cards now.
He does indeed. I want to go back to something you were saying earlier. When you look at these two economies, you talked about the Iranian economy and how long they can last. But there's another issue here, and that's the U.S. economy. And we were just talking against the Admiral about wars of attrition. When you look at who can outlast, if this becomes a waiting game, you've got the very serious straits the Iranian economy is in. But you've also got some not happy American consumers and a midterm coming up and a president and a party who wants to get reelected. If this lingers into the fall, who blinks first?
Well, we certainly know that there's one thing. We see it every 2 years, every 4 years, that gasoline prices really matter, and they really matter at the polls. And clearly that's in everybody's calculations right now. But you look at the position of the U.S. economy, we're going to grow, 2% or more this year, and I think this is one of the things that the financial markets are so driven by what's happening with AI, data centers, that vast, is it going to be $800 billion or $1 trillion of investment this year, that's bolstering the overall economy. Obviously, gasoline prices remain, it's the most sensitive political price in this country. But our economy overall is the envy of many other people, and Iran's economy is actually in shambles.
Let me put an unfair question to you as the last one. I know you're not an expert on monetary policy, but we have a Fed that's adamant they can kind of see through this conflict, or they said that at the beginning of it. How difficult does that become if this conflict persists?
Well,
in other words, what's the effect going to be on inflation in the economy broadly?
The question is, were we in an inflationary period beforehand for a lot of reasons, including the amount of expenditure and so forth, what's happened to supply chains? Once you build energy security, resilience in, that adds costs, and then simply all the inflationary impacts that come from these higher prices. And so you're going to, in order to see through inflation through this period, you're going to need really good glasses.
You're going to need really good glasses. We will leave it there. Dan Yergin of S&P Global Vice Chairman.
Wait a minute, I feel left out. You both have really good glasses. It's a very unfair note to end on, Dan. But we're very
well, one does think about them.
Thank you very much for joining us. As I say, it was great to have you on our first show. Now to have you again with that update was hugely beneficial. And I think, as I say, this is going to be a critical issue at this Fed meeting. I think that the decision is pretty much preordained, but I think there'll be a robust debate about how the Fed looks at this conflict the longer that it lasts.
Right. We're not expecting them to take action, but this is going to be a big point of discussion.
So we'll look to the minutes in a while to see sort of what the conversation was like there. And certainly when we have the succession, when there's a new Fed chair, we'll see how he approaches the economy in this moment as well.
All right, coming up, it's being called the Arc de Triomphe. It's just the latest in the president's ambitious plans to remodel the D.C. city skyline. We're going to take a closer look at the controversy here in the nation's capital with City Lab's Kristen Katz. We went all over the city, saw a couple sites, may or may not have been pushed off one of them by security, but we wanted to show you guys what the president is trying to do in the city and what architecture means to a presidency and to a place like Washington, D.C. That's coming up when we come back in just a little while.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Week, and I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. iHeartMedia reportedly holding talks about a possible sale to SiriusXM. Sources say the deal would create an audio giant, joining the largest radio station owner in the U.S. with the largest satellite radio service. The combined company would have more than $12 billion in sales. Bloomberg Radio provides programming to SiriusXM satellite radio. iHeartMedia is a strategic partner of Bloomberg Media. And sources tell Bloomberg the Trump administration weighing whether to invoke the Defense Production Act to support a potential bailout of Spirit Aviation. Now, the 1950 law gives the U.S. president emergency powers to direct production of goods and services that are critical to national defense. And that includes extending loans and making investments. Now, applying this statute to a commercial airline, well, that would likely face legal and political scrutiny. And prediction market platforms are getting some heat overseas. Brazil's government, it has blocked access to Polymarket and Kalshi, saying that they were out of compliance with federal gambling laws. Its finance minister said the move looks to protect the savings of Brazilians and address rising levels of household debt. Polymarket and Kalshi still in the headlines.
Very much so.
Christina, yes.
A lot to follow here, as always. Lisa, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Well,
Thanks,
President
Lisa.
Trump says he wants to clean up the Lincoln Memorial reflecting floor. I was driving around the city yesterday, saw that. It's empty. There's no water in it currently.
They drained it, right?
They've drained it. I drove by the Fed building, still under construction. Anyway, he wants to do this ahead of America's 250th birthday, which, of course, is this July.
He says that new floor color you're seeing on your screen there, it is quite blue. It is American flag blue.
Okay.
That's just one of the many architectural projects he's undertaking as president. And the biggest one may be yet to come. So this week, we took a tour of the city with our colleague over at City Labs to look at how the president is Trumpifying D.C. architecture and design.
The nation's capital has a few nicknames. The district, the swamp. But it's also the city of monuments, memorializing the fallen, commemorating conflict, and preserving past presidents in stone.
When you look at government architecture and people building monuments or associations or foundations or buildings that are literal foundations, what are they mostly for?
Well, they stand for people, they stand for places, they stand for significant moments in history.
Kristen Katz covers architecture for City Lab at Bloomberg. He took us to the site of a potential new addition to DC's landscape, the proposed Trump Triumphal Arch.
It's quite beautiful, as you can see, and this monumental arch will beam at 250 feet tall.
The edifice would sit at this grassy patch in the middle of a traffic circle at the end of Memorial Bridge.
This is where the arch will go.
And it's going to be how high?
250 feet tall.
How tall is that?
The Lincoln Memorial is about 100 feet tall, so it's going to be 2.5 times that.
So they want it to be taller than the Lincoln Memorial?
Much taller than almost any structure in Washington.
The monument, colloquially called Arc de Triomphe, has already raised protests from veterans groups who say it will destroy the line of sight across the bridge.
Memorial Circle is open for a reason. This is a site that stands between the Arlington House, which is Robert E. Lee's former home,
right,
and the Lincoln Memorial, which is, of course, the memorial, the monument to Abraham Lincoln. So it's a symbolic bridge. It represents the reunion of the country after the Civil War. And, you know, the detractors of the arch say that it would just stand between that symbolic unity.
You're supposed to be able to see from one down to the other.
You're supposed to be able to see from one down to the other. Now, the arch is going to be so big that the design renderings show that you could actually see Arlington House and the Lincoln Memorial from under it.
Okay.
But I don't know that that necessarily means it's not an occluded, blocked view.
When asked, the president seemed unconcerned.
That circle has sat there vacant for hundreds, like 150 years or something. The veterans are the ones that should like it. It's called the Triumphal Arch. It's in honor of the veterans.
And this isn't the only place the current president is leaving his mark, or his name. From the Kennedy Center.
When did this go up, Kristen?
This was a real surprise when this went up. It just kind of happened overnight. There was no act of Congress. There was no announcement.
And it's
above. Just appeared. It's above Kennedy's name on the Kennedy Memorial.
To the former U.S. Institute of Peace.
Did they stick on the letters?
They did, yes. This happened in December. It's now, I think, technically the Board of Peace, a slightly different organization.
From an aesthetic architecture perspective, why do people put their names on things? And is that something you typically see in a democratic society?
It's generally not the case that U.S. presidents go and just put their names on buildings that they like or want to have some association with.
Is there another president you can think of who has pushed through this many physical changes in Washington in recent memory?
No, it's really interesting. You know, if you look back, the changes have been so sudden. You have to really go back to the era of LBJ and Great Society.
There's also the demolition of the historic White House East Wing to make way for a ballroom, paving over the Rose Garden lawn into a patio, and gold embossed everything.
There's a lot of gold lettering happening at the White House these days.
Is that, what style is that? Is that neoclassical? Is that early Mar-a-Lago? Does it have a name?
I think Mar-a-Lago might be closer than neoclassical.
All right.
The White House says the ballroom will be paid for by private funds. The funding for some of the other projects, including the arch, is still unclear. What's also unclear is how many of these alterations will be completed before the president leaves office or endure after he's gone.
We're getting kicked out.
They didn't put Trump on the security truck.
Oh, yeah. You want to get that? It's not on the truck. And props to our crew who managed to get this shot while who you don't see is the security guard almost immediately to his left there talking to us. We got one shot at that. We got about 30 seconds up there before they immediately shoop, and we're like, you got to go.
Unbelievable. I was unprepared for how wide this is across the city. I mean, I've seen the White House and all of the gold, but
it's a lot of other places too. It's like Meridian Park, and it's the fountains, at different locations, and it's like sites that people go and gather. All of a sudden, are getting facelifts. It's very interesting.
What's the reaction of people? That's what I want to know. People who around the area. I mean, what do they? Do they want it? Do they not want it? It's all this back and forth.
I mean, let's ask people who live in the area. Our own Jeff Mason is here on set. My former Adams Morgan neighbor.
Yay!
I mean. To David's point, I haven't been back in a while, and I also even was startled at how many things say 250th, getting repaired, Logan's Circle, just places that people like go eat lunch or getting a facelift.
I don't think President Trump necessarily needed an excuse, but the fact that 250th is this year is the best gift he could have gotten as the second-term president during this period of our country's history. He's a builder. He likes to put his name on things. And he's doing it all over the city. And you're right in your package to name the multiple places where that's doing. Where he's doing that. To the question of how is D.C. reacting, it's mixed. I mean, some of it, he is wanting to beautify the city. He's wanting to make the city more secure. That's why you see National Guard members walking all around Washington, D.C. He likes to take credit for that. He likes to see sort of the physical manifestations of what he's doing, but not everybody likes it.
He also likes a round number, so this is now the arch 250 feet tall because it is the 250th anniversary. He also likes to talk about this stuff, and you were in the Oval Office this week, and we saw what's played out many times before in the Cabinet Room or the Oval Office, where he, encourages you to go look outside and see what's happening at the White House.
Very specifically, he said, to turn around and look, and right behind us, we were looking at him, of course, sitting behind the Resolute desk, to look behind us at the area, the entrance to the Oval Office and the new cement that they were putting in, which we couldn't really see well, and we thought at another point that they were going to physically take us out, but they didn't. yeah, he's putting in apparently black-colored cement, and cement may be the wrong material. I may have that wrong, but flooring.
You're not a builder, Jeff.
I'm not. Definitively not a builder.
Expertise, granite and cement may not be it.
Do need to redo my kitchen at some point. Maybe I'll call the president and ask him what to do. But that aside, putting in black flooring along the area, that famous colonnade where presidents have walked for decades.
Oh, wow.
So.
We've only got about 30 seconds left, but I know you were also at the Kennedy Center this week, and you were able to go inside because it was shut down when we were there, when we were shooed away. What did you see? And
Interesting
what was it like?
about the Kennedy Center, they are shutting it down for 2 years starting in July
Yeah.
to do a $257 million renovation. It's very controversial in D.C. because this is such a landmark that's being shut down. They started to really make their case to the press, the public, and lawmakers by showing us, in this case, the areas that they are going to renovate and talked about why it needs to be shut down in order to get that done. There is a lot of damage in that center, and all of the funding for that is coming from Congress. So the controversy over that may or may not come down a little bit, but they're trying to make their case.
Maybe you took down the name. That would have been an easier argument for some of the folks.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Jeff Mason, we're going to see you more later.
Right.
Thanks so much.
Coming up here, Lisa's most read stories. It's BTW. BT-dubs, as Christina says on Bloomberg this weekend.
Hey, I finally got you to say it. All right, remember to explore live streaming news and interviews on all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporters, analysis, and more, all in one place, Bloomberg.com/videos. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend, BT Dubs. And now it is time for BT Dubs or BTW. Constant sort of debate here at the desk. But Lisa Mateo, what you got?
All right, so we all know things are getting more expensive, right? Between gas, groceries, even drinks at certain events. Okay, so leads me to this next headline. This one's from the Wall Street Journal. It says, drinks are so expensive that grown-ups are pre-gaming like they did in college. Okay?
Fireball.
If you remember,
This is amazing.
If you remember the
for our radio
pre-game.
audience, the picture of Fireball on the screen.
Something you were able to identify very quickly, David Gura.
You know,
See,
I'm
he
sure
was.
there's
We're learning
glasses down here
new
when we say
things about you, David Gura. But they're drinking at home before you go out. So let's say you're going out to a sporting event, to a concert. So you go home first. You have a cup of cocktails to save you money when you go there because they could be like $20 each.
Well, the prices are obscene.
Yes.
I just went to a game at Yankee Stadium. It was not a Yankees game.
Yes.
It was a New York City Football Club game. And the beer was like $22.
It is.
It was
beer?
unbelievable.
Yes.
And that was not for the souvenir cup. It was not for the imported beer. It was for the regular old American lager, $22. So they were happy for me to put on a credit card. I mean, it's like a bit crazy.
It is. And now people are doing what on social media, what's going around is that people are telling how to sneak stuff in. So they're doing those little, the little bottles.
That really is like college.
Yes.
Like, get your flask out.
You put the flask is coming back too. Yes, exactly.
That's hysterical.
So because it's so expensive, so now all these things are happening, and people are doing what they have to do. They're even post gaming, like after the event at someone else's house instead of going to the bar after. So.
Fascinating.
Changing times.
Nips, they're called.
Nips are back, yes.
It kind of makes me nostalgic, but also I am sick of paying these prices, so I'm torn on this one.
Yeah, it is crazy. And don't get me started on popcorn. Nobody's bringing popcorn in under their jackets, but that was also expensive.
I went to the movies for the first time the other day, and I got a small soda, and it was like $8 or $12. I almost left. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, Lisa, what else you got?
You know what else is expensive? FIFA tickets.
Yes, I've heard this.
Okay,
and they're hard to get.
Let's get right to this one. This one's from The Athletic. Okay, so FIFA struggling to sell tickets for USMNT's World Cup opener versus Paraguay. So The Athletic got their hands on this document, right? And it said that ticket sales to the U.S. World Cup opener against Paraguay on June 12th, it's lagging behind other matches in Los Angeles. And this is like the opener. So they thought that it was going to be this big draw. So, they had the prices right
men's
high.
national team. People want to go.
They wanted to go. But people are not spending the high prices. So that's the issue. And they're saying that maybe it's because the men's national soccer team, well, they haven't sparked that much interest lately. So that might be a reason.
Put up that screen with how much those tickets cost. That's why.
It's
It was
ridiculous.
crazy.
Anyway,
I think it's just ticket
Yes.
fatigue. Like, I don't pay for any of this stuff. I don't go to concerts I would love to go to because I'm not paying.
There we go. Category 1 and 2 tickets,
That's insane.
$27.30 and $19.40 for tickets for these games. I mean, that's crazy.
It's a lot. But to go to show you is that people are not paying it because they're not selling out those tickets.
The other issue with this, which we're going to talk about later in the show with some experts, is not only that, but people are afraid to come because of visa issues. Like foreign audiences are concerned. Friends of mine in Europe and other places have said They are worried about coming to the United States in ways that they haven't before. So you may not be getting as big of a foreign audience to watch these games, and then Americans may not pay that.
Are they going to get cheaper? Is that the upshot here? That they're going to have to get rid of them? Or no, we don't know.
They're going to have to. They haven't brought it down
Yeah.
yet, but now they might have to because they're just not selling that first game. Okay, since we're here in D.C.,
we are.
I thought this would be a good one. Okay, this is from the Washington Post. Ben's Chili Bowl hopes May reopening meets its matriarch standards. So we all know Ben's Chili here in Washington, D.C., right?
Tell
has
us about this place.
68-year history.
I mean, all the presidents until recently always went. It is an absolute institution. It's on U Street. They've got a big mural on the wall of all the presidents who ate there. Like it's still, the family was still there when I was here a couple years ago. Even at Nat Stadium, when they built the new stadium, they built a spot for Ben's Chili Bowl to have an outpost there. There's now one in the airport. Like, this is the D.C. iconic institution.
Okay,
oh my gosh,
well,
Lisa
it's been closed.
Lisa Mateo, it is 9 o'clock in the morning.
For renovations, but it's going to be opening May 1st. But in honor,
thank you for bringing that.
We had some, I guess it was DoorDash, Uber Eats. Someone came by.
Force our audience to watch
and we have Ben's Chili here for you guys. I personally have never tried, so I'm excited.
And there's a half smoke, I think.
And there's a half smoke here for you.
So I just told you guys my secret about the half smokes, which now that you can reveal.
Lisa Mateo always taking care of us
I'm
here.
always thinking of you guys.
Oh my gosh.
I'm telling you,
So,
I scored.
Here, have the saltines, too, if you want the saltine crackers.
I don't eat beef, and I haven't since I was 18.
But today you are going to.
I eat half smokes at the ballpark.
You do.
Only
That's
the
your
ballpark.
one thing.
There's an exception at the ballpark. They are so good that about once or twice a year when I go to a Nats game, I pretend it's not beef and I eat it
I've been
anyway.
told whoever loses pointed today has to eat the chili.
Ooh.
Oh, that's a great idea.
A good one. We're going to bring these back.
I think this is your week, David Gura.
Hold on. We've derailed this. So the matriarch has passed away.
She is still alive, but she's hoping that the renovations don't change the look of it.
I see.
And
okay.
she hasn't seen it yet. So when she
goes,
yes, she wants to go and see like how it's going to look.
Okay.
So it'll be exciting. May 1st is
So
the
she's
date.
very concerned with the legacy.
Yeah,
Still very much
it was a
alive.
local place. It was casual. There was like a line and a counter, and
Yes.
so you don't want it to look like it got bought by a VC firm.
Exactly,
you
like
want
the
it to
Crate and
maintain-
Barrel thing that
Yeah, a
they
little bit of
went through.
grime in your chili. Like
They
it's not
tried.
good unless there's a little bit of grime.
They expanded, though, over there on H Street. They put one in on H Street all the way down.
There's a couple of them now. So.
I have this last one. This is
Okay,
from the
sorry.
weekend. Quick mention.
Yep.
Pokemon's multi-billion-dollar card boom sparks a crime wave. Okay, so this one is interesting. So trading cards, right? They came this alternative asset class, but they caused prices to soar. So now value is driven higher because millennials and Gen Z who collected them, they now have this disposable income. So now they're starting to buy them. The prices have spiked. You remember Logan Paul, like the YouTuber? He sold his card for $16 million at auction. So
I'm sorry, $16 million
$16 million for one Pokemon card.
Okay.
But it's bringing on the risks. You know, they have people like there's thefts that are happening. And so this is what people are concerned about because all for Pokemon cards.
Yeah, I've lived through that. I've got
Lots
some
of-
sons who were collecting Pokemon cards and enjoyed the,
Yeah.
you know.
They haven't been
the
stolen
whole-
though yet, right?
No.
Oh, phew! I thought you said I lived through that. I was like,
Nor as I can
oh.
ascertain are they worth any money, but maybe they are. I should check into that. Lisa.
Thanks,
the
Lisa.
PTW, thank you very much. Thanks for the half smoke.
Eat up.
And chili. As we come up on 9 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., ahead with us in studio, Republican Congressman Michael McCaul from Texas joins us. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television right now.
Coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, mixed messages from the White House and Iran.
The Iranians want to talk. They want to talk in person.
America's special envoys fly to Pakistan today, but will there be direct talks between the parties?
Plus, a pivot on Powell. The Justice Department drops its investigation into the Fed chair.
And we shouldn't be holding our nation's economy hostage because of a disagreement with the Department of Justice.
What does it mean for President Trump's pick to replace him?
And a Trump ally floats the idea of replacing Iran with Italy at the World Cup this summer. Italy's reaction and a look at the power of sports diplomacy.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, along with Lisa Mateo. It is Saturday, April the 25th. As Christina mentioned, we are here in Washington. The White House Correspondents Association dinner is tonight. The bevy of parties surrounding it began, last night, the night before?
Wednesday night.
I count on you to tell me. I haven't been to any yet, but I will venture into the Hilton Ballroom tonight.
We tried very hard, viewers and listeners, to peer pressure David Gura into coming out. Lisa, our whole team, our executive producer, we all went out. David Gura went home.
I tucked in early, I think wisely.
The adults
we did
among
have
us.
to get here extremely early today.
Yeah, I was here an hour before you.
Well, that's true. All the truth comes out here.
I have not slept. It's going to be great. It's going to be great.
That's playing out here. We're also watching talks happening in Pakistan. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner expected to depart for Islamabad sometime this morning. No indication yet if that's happened. Josh Wingrove in West Palm Beach, has been keeping us apprised of that. He's with the president, who, Christina, is going to make his way back to D.C. tonight
last
to be
we
at the
heard,
event.
he said he's been peppering, the White House with questions, and they have not given them guidance yet about when those folks are leaving, if they're leaving today. But first, we want to go to Lisa Mateo with our 9 a.m. news updates.
And let's get right to those talks. The White House does say Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, the president's son-in-law Jared Kushner, intend to meet with Iranian officials in Pakistan this weekend to try and end the war. Now, absent from the talks, Vice President J.D. Vance, lead negotiator for the U.S. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
The Vice President, the Secretary of State, will be waiting here in the United States for updates, and the Vice President, I understand, is on standby and will be willing to dispatch to Pakistan if we feel it's a necessary use of his time.
Meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister is in Pakistan and has met with Pakistan's prime minister. According to the prime minister's office, a spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry said their top diplomat will meet only with Pakistani officials with no talks planned with the U.S. Leavitt, though, claims that the Iranians had reached out to the U.S. to arrange those fresh round of talks. Now, this all comes as the U.S. increased pressure on Iran with its naval blockade. President Donald Trump ordered the U.S. Navy to shoot any boats that are putting mines in the Strait of Hormuz after the military intercepted 2 oil supertankers that tried to evade restrictions on traffic to and from Iran's ports. Well, to the war in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Russia carried out one of the largest attacks on Ukraine overnight, killing 4 people, leaving over 30 wounded across the country. Ukraine's general staff said Russia launched nearly 50 ballistic missiles and more than 600 drones. And in other news, U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro dropping her investigation into Fed Chair Jay Powell and building renovation cost overruns by the central bank. In a social media post, Pirro said that the Fed's Inspector General is looking into it and that she will restart a criminal investigation if their report calls for it. Now, as far as for the confirmation of Kevin Warsh, President Donald Trump's pick to be the next Fed chair, the Senate Banking Committee says it will vote on Wednesday for his nomination. And the U.S. Special Forces soldier charged with using classified information to win money on Polymarket, he's been released on bond. Federal prosecutors say Master Sergeant Gannon Ken Van Dyke used inside information about the mission to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to win more than $400,000 on Polymarket. Now, he's been ordered to appear Tuesday in U.S. District Court in Manhattan, where he's being indicted on wire fraud and other charges. Christina and David, we'll send it back to you.
Thanks, Lisa. All right now, Iran's foreign minister is in Islamabad, Pakistan, meeting with the prime minister. He also today, the president's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, are set, we think, to go to Pakistan. But as we were just mentioning, David, we don't have timing on that yet.
No timing. The problem seems to be Iran says there's no meeting planned with those key U.S. negotiators. So here to talk about what is likely to play out or could play out, I suppose, is Bloomberg reporter Eric Martin, who was just in Islamabad for that first round of talks and covers the State Department for us here at Bloomberg. Get us up to speed on what the administration is saying about the prospects for these talks. I think that there was a lot of anticipation going into that first round. It does seem like the expectations are perhaps a bit more muted.
Well, certainly this weekend, the talks have been a moving, or this week, the talks have been a moving target. We saw on Tuesday a lot of anticipation waiting for the vice president to get on a plane to go to Pakistan. We saw the last minute changes to that reporting in terms of a meeting in Washington and envoys Kushner and Witkoff coming to Washington instead of going to Pakistan. So like everything, this is a very fluid situation. And remember, it takes a long time to go to Pakistan, to get to Pakistan. I experienced that a couple of weeks ago. I'm still recovering my voice from that trip. And so I did the math. It took about 26 hours last time around for the vice president's plane to get to Pakistan, 17 in the air, and then there's 26 hours difference from Washington. And so, the earliest we could potentially see them in Pakistan if they were leaving now would be Sunday morning there. This is, an evolving situation, but I think it's a good sign that we're seeing the envoys going rather than a principal like the vice president because that takes some pressure off of the process. It means that there's not the same pressure to deliver. Usually the president or vice president is the closer.
Right.
They go in when there's a deal. We stayed up all night a couple of Saturdays ago, waiting for the vice president to come out. 15 hours of constant talks, 21 hours on the ground. It was just exhausting. And so, we've seen the Iranians signaling that they're not talking directly to the U.S. They're not expecting to, that they're expecting to go on to Russia and to Oman this weekend. And so we're kind of back to the stage where we're having notes passed between each side and where they're not all sitting together at the table. But some positive signs from the reporting that we've had from Iran in that they have a written response to the U.S. proposal and maybe dialing things down a notch in terms of the envoys, less of a press presence. Most of us are here in Washington trying to get David out to a party tonight. And so, it's something where there's just a little bit less intensity than what we had 2 weeks ago.
That's really interesting because we've been talking about how it might complicate things, the mismatch levels of folks, right? Because the Iranian foreign minister is over there. You generally want to pair like with like. You expect the Secretary of State to go over there and whether the Iranians would be willing to engage in someone. But as our team pointed out, there's this very special status that Witkoff and Kushner have that is not unlike other administrations. And to your point, one of the criticisms has been the lack of working level meetings. So it seems like you're saying maybe because they're not there, they can actually get things done.
There's just less pressure. No one's necessarily expecting a press conference from Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner when they come out. That's not been traditionally the way things have worked, whether it's been in Geneva, in Islamabad.
Despite all efforts by you and others.
Despite our best efforts as stalkers to chase them down hallways and get them to tell us what's going on behind closed doors, the fact that there's not typically that readout immediately after means that you can kind of lower the temperature a little bit and maybe find more flexible landing zones in a process like this. But of course, as you said, Christina, the credibility that the envoys bring, the president's son-in-law and a close friend of the president, they have that credibility, which you don't necessarily have from a career staffer, somebody in the Foreign Service or the National Security Council. So still important and still having that kind of key access and influence and ability. That space to negotiate, but just a little bit less pressure than when it's the vice president and all eyes of the world are just on that hotel.
Eric Martin, great to see you. Eric Martin covers the State Department for us here at Bloomberg.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you back. All right, joining us now is Republican Congressman Michael McCaul of Texas. He, of course, serves on the Foreign Affairs and Homeland Security committees. You know who I did see out last night, David Gura?
Wasn't me. It was the chairman emeritus was out. He was out and about.
Hey, you were there too.
Oh, absolutely was. Looking very respectful. British Embassy event. Nothing untoward.
Of course. Yeah.
Thank you for getting up early. I know it's.
Thank you. I'll be sitting at the Bloomberg table tonight.
Excellent,
so,
excellent. Yeah. This is how we could exert pressure to get you in the studio this early. I mean, you heard Eric. You're very experienced in foreign policy. What do you give the odds of these talks succeeding in any kind of near-term timeline?
I don't see any big breakthrough in the near term. I think his analysis is correct. I think to lower the expectations is smart. If you have the vice president there, that's usually when you sign the deal.
Right.
So I think they're doing this in the right way. Iran is notorious for being dilatory in its tactics. Trying to get to a deal, but then pulling the rug out at the last minute. And then when you do get a deal, it's trust but verify, and it's very hard to trust them. And I think that's the big issue.
I'm curious, we've been following this, as Eric said, everything's changing hour by hour. I'm curious for you, as Chairman Emeritus of the Foreign Affairs Committee, are you getting the information that you need about the diplomatic objectives and how these talks are unfolding? Or are you, like us, kind of fumbling a bit here, trying to figure out who's doing what and who's running point?
I mean, it could be better. I even in the prior administration, I would get calls from the Secretary of State. I think on this
You're talking about a Democratic administration.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they've been very close to the vest on this. And I understand that, but it's also important to reach out to Congress. We're under Article 1, a separate but equal branch of government. And so I've been to Islamabad. He's right. It's a very long ways away, and it's a very different part of the world. I do applaud Pakistan, though, for stepping up and being an intermediary between the two parties. I'm not very sanguine under this regime in Iran that you're going to have anything in the short term. I applaud the president for not hitting civilian infrastructure. That's almost an act of, war crime,
yeah.
To be honest with you. And so I think this is the right path. I know the markets have responded very well to this. I don't think it's in any best interest to see this drag on the war drag on, if you will, when they see rising gas prices. There's a lot of pressure actually on the White House to get this thing resolved, but I don't know, and I think Iran knows that too. And I always am very skeptical. I think they're always trying to play us.
But to that point, as we've talked about, the reason this administration pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement the first time is they said because Iran couldn't be trusted, and even if they entered a deal, it wasn't worth the piece of paper it was written on.
Right.
Those facts on the ground have not innately changed.
No.
Are they going to be able to get a better deal this time around?
Well, the JCPOA would have legalized a nuclear bomb in Iran today. That's what we were saying back when we opposed that. I look, as long as this regime is in power, you're going to have this problem. And we've had this problem since 1979. Every president since then has said no nuclear, warhead in Iran. But no president's really done anything. They tried the JCPOA. President Trump's the first president to actually act and hit Iran where it hurts. But I do think in the early days of this, when the Ayatollah was with his cabinet underground and they were annihilated and taken out, there was a hope that there could be a regime change at that point in time. But the fact is it didn't happen. And I don't know if the American people have the appetite to stay in long term to finish that job, or whether we hand that off to Israel and let Mossad try to do that. I don't know. But as long as this regime is in power, we're going to have this problem.
Let me ask you about that, because there's a big piece in the Times about the state of the new supreme leader, grievously injured, getting a lot of medical care from a very small group of physicians. People are passing notes to get to him because they're worried about giving any indication of where he might be. But what you're talking about raises this point of who does the U.S. need to talk to if its objectives here are to get some sort of regime change or to really change Iran? Mm-hmm. Was that a colossal misstep, do you think, by this administration, killing those who could have been perhaps partners in trying to change the course in Iran?
Well, after the 12-day war, they didn't step up, and they were not willing negotiating partners. Yeah. Now they're no longer in this world, but there is a line of succession in Iran, and that's taking place. Their foreign minister seems to be the point of contact for this negotiation. But they have, they're going to continue to, as long as this regime's in power, we're going to have this problem. And so, they've been a source of torture and agony and terror in the Middle East since 1979. And until that regime is gone, it's going to be hard to have peace in the Middle East. It's going to be hard as Jared Kushner goes there, who was the architect of the Abraham Accords, to have normalization between Saudis and the Arab world and Israel. We were getting so close to that. That's when October 7th happened. When those talks of normalization were going on, Iran saw that, it lit up its proxies, and that's why we had October 7th.
But given David's question and the fact that, to your point, that regime did not fall, it is still there in possibly a hardened form, is the Iran we have now potentially more dangerous and unpredictable than the Iran we had before this conflict started?
Possibly. Their military industrial complex has been severely degraded, right, and that's the good news. The bad news is the regime still continues to move, forward. And I think you're going to continue to have that problem of trusting them. And it's a very fanatical, this is not Venezuela and a decapitation of Venezuela. That was a beautiful military operation. This one, far more difficult. It's a larger country. It's hard to effectuate regime change without troops on the ground, which I would not recommend. I think we put our troops in the ground there. They become magnets for the jihadists. We saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years. I don't think that would be a good idea. I do think Israel, though, with Mossad, remember, they can carry out political assassinations. Congress has made that illegal. They can do things we can't. And I think maybe they're perhaps in a better position to try to effectuate that. It's very complicated, though.
Increasingly, when we talk about Iran, we're talking about China and the degree to which China is advantaged by this war continuing. I'm curious, if the president were to call you up and ask for your counsel ahead of his trip to China, what you would say. What are the objectives he should have in making that having that meeting with President Xi that's been postponed once already?
I would lay conditions. The meeting itself is a concession of any president to meet with Chairman Xi, who is perhaps our greatest adversary in the world right now, the great power competition. And I would lay conditions. First, I would say, hey, stop assisting Iran in the region. I would say the same thing to Mr. Putin. Stop providing drone technology. Stop providing targeting information on our military. I would say the same thing to Chairman Xi. I'm not going to meet and have a détente-like meeting if you're going to continue to arm Iran with your software that helps with your drone technologies. That should be an absolute precondition to any meeting.
We've only got about 30 seconds before we have to let you go, but I do want to ask you about the cabinet shuffling we're seeing and the changes in leadership in the president's inner court. Do you think this is a positive thing, or do you think this is a sign of disarray and chaos in the White House?
Well, some was due to, I think, malpractice on the part of the cabinet members. I mean, the labor secretary had some really gross violations going on. I think Christina is a colleague of mine. I respect her. But what they did with Bovino and how they handled that situation, I was a little surprised by the Attorney General, Pam Bondi's firing. There was a piece, though, that came out in Politico today that talks about this very issue. He has a limited window on confirmations. Right. So there are a few more of these firings in the queue, as I understand it. And so the advice was, look, if you're going to do this, do it now while you have time to get confirmations done before the midterms. Otherwise, don't do it.
Who's next? Do you want to preview? You have information that we don't?
I'm not going to. Well,
save for the dinner.
You can read Politico.
Congressman Mike McCaul, thank you so much. Always lovely to see you, sir.
Good seeing you.
Great to see you here on set. All right, coming up, ceasefire talks expected in Pakistan this weekend, but we are still waiting to find out when Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner will depart for Pakistan. We're going to check in again with our Washington reporters straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio on the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg.com. Stay with us.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And residents in a town north of Oklahoma City are picking up the pieces after violent tornadoes damaged about 40 homes but spared lives. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt.
Just heart goes out to these folks, and we'll do whatever we can. The Oklahoma standard will be in display as neighbors help neighbors, and we come together.
The National Weather Service says the EF4 tornado was on the ground for 9 miles, packing winds of 170 to 175 miles per hour. So from tornadoes to fires in southeast Georgia, more than 120 homes have been destroyed, while thousands more remain threatened by 2 large blazes. Investigators believe one of the fires was sparked by a foil balloon touching power lines. And in northern Florida, a volunteer firefighter died battling a wildfire. In company news, NVIDIA has extended its lead as the world's most valuable company. Shares rose to their first record in months on Friday, pushing its market cap to more than $5 trillion. Expectations that massive spending on AI computing infrastructure continue to drive that rally. And Google plans to invest up to $40 billion in Anthropic. That's the Alphabet-owned company. It's committing to invest $10 billion now in cash at a $350 billion valuation. Dave and Christina, they'll invest another $30 billion more if Anthropic hits those performance targets.
Tens and hundreds of billions still in this AI space. Worth following there. Lisa, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Well,
Thanks,
President
Lisa.
Trump is facing his worst approval numbers ever, skyrocketing prices, and a war with Iran that he has already declared the U.S. has won. Take a listen to this exchange between the president and our Bloomberg White House correspondent, our colleague, Jeff Mason.
How long are you willing to wait until you get a unified response?
Don't rush me, Jeff. Guys like you want to say, oh, so we were in Vietnam for 18 years. We were in Iraq for many, many years. We're in for I don't like to say World War II because that was a biggie, but we were 4.5, almost 5 years in World War II. We were in the Korean War for 7 years. I've been doing this for 6 weeks.
Priceless. Jeff Mason is back with us on set. Of course, he's becoming our fourth anchor. We're very happy to have you. And our White House bureau chief, Peggy Collins, is here
Bureau
on
Chief,
set.
yes.
Washington bureau chief. Sorry, it's been a long week already. I apologize.
I know.
Thank you both for being here. First of all, Peggy, I just want to get your impression about where these Iran negotiations are going, what you're hearing here from Washington, and if you think this approach is going to work.
Well, I think we're in a bit of a stalemate right now in the sense that we're trying to report out talks on talks. So Caroline Leavitt said yesterday in the press briefing that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are on their way to Pakistan for more talks. The Iranians also appear to be in Pakistan for some talks. But we're trying to get back to the table to then get to the point for the all-important negotiations around opening the Strait. At Bloomberg, we're reporting every day really at that intersection of government, business, and the energy markets, because that is what really it's coming down to right now.
It's been so interesting for me as someone who's new here and new-ish-er to the energy market side of it. It is so tied into foreign policy at this moment. It is almost a little bit easier to get your hands around what are sometimes squishy economic concepts because it all matters in these negotiations.
That's right. And one of the phrases we heard a lot this week from business leaders and from policymakers was this phrase, demand destruction. And that seems to be where people are starting to focus. The longer the Strait is closed, the longer people will be potentially under strain in terms of energy, fertilizer, and all of that filters through the economy. Certainly, Americans are seeing gas prices go up, but there's other things that could be affected soon in terms of farmers with food prices and things like that. So we are certainly looking at that as we head into summer travel and the midterms, where the economy is one of the biggest factors that voters are looking at when they decide.
Jeff, we all laughed at that comment from the president. It isn't you who's rushing him, but there are members of his own party, lawmakers who do want this to wrap up sooner rather than later, who heard his initial timeline for all of this and have seen it really attenuated over these last few weeks. So moving beyond what he had to say there, what is the White House thinking realistically about how long this is going to last and how long they can stomach this lasting as we see prices going up as a result?
Well, I think that comment is also emblematic of the pressure he's feeling. And to Peggy's comment and analysis as well, he knows the midterms are coming right up. He knows that people are concerned about gasoline prices. He is ready to be done with this war. And yet he is also someone who built both his business life and his political life on being someone who's a deal maker. So he doesn't want a bad deal. And that was a concern, that he wasn't going to get that good deal. So he doesn't want to be rushed by people asking him questions, or more, he doesn't want to be rushed by lawmakers and others in the town of Washington, D.C. who are giving him some pressure, including from his own party.
And people within his circle as well, including
100%.
Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, who we know would really like to focus on the economy and those kitchen table issues ahead of the midterms. Speaking of, I want to ask you about this Jerome Powell news and the fact that this investigation has been stopped, potentially paused, because that was a big sticking point for the president, too. Members of his own party were saying, take the win, move on, let it, step away from this, let it go so that you can have your candidate confirmed and so that Senator Tellis will allow this vote to take place. Who do you think got through to the president? Do we know what finally made him change his mind, or was it just the facts at hand?
I don't know the answer to who, but I'm going to draw both of those stories together and say it actually wasn't a great week for the president.
Really?
Yeah, because that's one of the fights that he's been fighting. He really wanted to make a point with the Fed, and the result of that was his next nominee has been held up. So this investigation ending is a blow in some ways to him politically, and yet it's also exactly what he needs to get the person into the Fed that he wants to. The reason I say it wasn't a great week is he also had to, he didn't have progress in Iran at a time when he was saying, I'm not going to extend the ceasefire. He said that to me in a phone conversation on Monday. I don't want to extend. And then he had to extend. So it does, it shows that sometimes what the president says and what he wants is not what ends up being the case or what he gets.
Peggy, he wants all of this wrapped up. So as we reported, we have a vote in the Senate Banking Committee on Wednesday, scheduled for Wednesday of this week. That's going to happen. We haven't heard from Senator Tillis. As Christina pointed out, the DOJ investigation is over, but it's being shifted, so it continues. We haven't heard from Chair Powell if he'll be satisfied with the fact that one is done but not the other. Talk a bit about that, the uncertainty that remains here. This isn't a tidy, neat thing yet, at least.
No, there's so much drama around the Fed, and usually it is not one of the most dramatic places that you can find news, but certainly this year it has been. And I think, like you were saying, David, there's an open question as to whether or not Chair Powell will leave the Fed board. I think that's the next big chapter in this
he has
dramatic
till 28
play.
if he wants to stay as a governor.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it looks like, based on Warsh's hearings this past week and the decision by the DOJ on Friday and the hearing on Wednesday, as you said, next week, that Kevin Warsh will become the next Fed chair. The question is whether Powell will actually leave the Fed board or whether he will stay on and be, another influencer and power figure in the Fed, given all of his years there. So that's going to be the next question. And there's some wiggle room in what the DOJ said on Friday, enough that our reporting this morning is indicating Chair Powell will not leave yet if he thinks it's not clear that any investigations will actually be done.
And speaking of leadership shakeups, we were just talking to Congressman McCaul about these cabinet shakeups and who might potentially be next. I want to ask you, who do you think could potentially be next for a change of job? Are we looking at Kash Patel, who's been coming under a lot of fire lately? Are we looking at folks like Howard Lutnick, who've been getting, a lot of, he's been under fire for his connections with Jeffrey Epstein? Who do you think is on the verge from the president to maybe need to update their resume?
Well, I'll take Jeff's line there and say, I don't know, but we are certainly reporting it out. I will note, though, there's been a big shift this year. Last year, the second term of the Trump administration was defined in many ways by its consistency,
it was surprisingly
its loyalty
stable, yeah,
compared to the first term. And it was a source of pride that, the cabinet secretaries were all, in place and there was no churn. Now we're seeing the churn now. We not only had some cabinet secretaries step down of late, we also had the Secretary of the Navy exit this week. There's been a lot of change at the Pentagon during the war. So there's a lot of churn now, and it may be also related to two things, the pressure of the war, but also the pressure of the midterms coming around the corner.
Jeff, let's talk a little bit about President Trump's adventures in dirigism. He has gotten the U.S. government involved in private companies in a way that I think would be surprising to a lot of traditional Republicans. Spirit Airlines going through Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
You want to buy an airline, David?
He has now floated what? What is the latest thinking on how he might or the government might approach this airline, which is not doing well?
Well, let's be clear, number one, that sometimes President Trump just says things that have not been vetted, that have not, I mean, that goes without saying that not everything he says gets vetted. So sometimes he will say things and then his policymakers will have to follow up, or his spokespeople will have to follow up and figure out if that's really what they're going to do. The interesting thing about that comment was it sent the Spirit Airlines shares soaring because of the possibility of government intervention.
And I should have set this up. He suggests maybe the Defense Production Act could be used here to what? They could take over this airline and send military. I mean, I would say it's a wild suggestion from the president.
And my mouth is open in part because, I don't know how you make that connection between the Defense Production Act and buying an airline that is failing. Other than the fact that this president and others have used the Defense Production Act for a lot of things, certainly during the COVID era. But how you connect that to this airline, other than something that President Donald Trump is very good at, getting the conversation going and maybe finding another private investor to say, let's take a second look at this because the president's watching.
And also testing boundaries and norms and guardrails. And this is something we've seen not just here, but across the spectrum. I mean, even the piece we did about putting his name on all these buildings, I said to our City Labs colleague, Christina, I said, can he do that? And the answer is, well, no one's ever tried before. So a lot of these places, Peggy, talk to us about the way the president has and continues to test the system and why the system didn't quite seem prepared for that and is still struggling to keep up with the changes he's trying to make across the board.
Well, I think he's tested the limits, but also he sees the presidential and executive branch as having a lot of power, and they're using it. So with all of the executive orders that we saw come flowing out of the administration last year, that is one of the tools that they've used. But also the president himself has said, he's a business leader. So he's approaching a lot of these things like he would as if he is a CEO. And we've seen the norms be tested, as Jeff was saying, in terms of where government is as a deal maker now with private companies as well. We saw the Intel stake last summer, and now we're seeing some of the deal making going on with Spirit. The difference with Spirit that we've seen some business leaders react to is there's a question about the national security argument tied to it. Whereas with Intel last summer, there was a clear line there. And that's where some people in the markets are saying, hey, is this getting too far into the a free flow of capital with private companies and the government.
Jeff, last question to you, which is just about his engagement with matters like this. I think last week when we were on the air and he did a big thing in the Oval Office about psychedelics and expanding research into that. There is a war going on, and I'm curious what his engagement with these other matters says about his engagement with that, the degree to which he wants to talk about or be engaged with what's happening in the Middle East.
I think you can probably conclude that he's over the war. He's just ready to move on. Even so, again, back to what I said earlier, he still wants to get a good deal. So he can't just walk away from it, and the U.S. still has major assets in the region. But he wants to talk about the ballroom. He wants to talk about the sidewalk. He wants to talk about these other issues. I think my last thought on that is he's really interested in talking about things that didn't used to be Republican orthodoxy, and that's fascinating, too.
Great to talk to both of you. Peggy Collins, our Washington Bureau Chief, Jeff Mason, our White House correspondent. Thanks very much for joining us here.
Don't rush him, Jeff.
Don't rush
No
me.
rushing.
Don't rush
No
him.
rushing.
Great to see you both. All right, the World Cup just weeks away at stadiums across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. What does it take to get hundreds of athletes from dozens of countries, all of these stadiums, all these cities around the hemisphere? We're going to talk to two experts in sports diplomacy. Up next on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. iHeartMedia reportedly holding talks about a possible sale to SiriusXM. Now, sources say the deal would create an audio giant, joining the largest radio station owner in the U.S. with the largest satellite radio service. The combined company would have more than $12 billion in sales. Bloomberg Radio provides programming to SiriusXM satellite radio. iHeartMedia is a strategic partner of Bloomberg Media. Sources tell Bloomberg the Trump administration weighing whether to invoke the Defense Production Act to support a potential bailout of Spirit Aviation. Now, that 1950 law gives the U.S. president emergency powers to direct production of goods and services that are critical to national defense, and that includes extending loans and making investments. Applying the statute, though, to commercial airline would likely face legal and political scrutiny. And some wedding dresses are now coming with a legal waiver for brides on GLP-1s. Yes, the Wall Street Journal reporting that weight loss drugs, they have made fitting brides for their big day more difficult. Bridal stores, they're being forced to stock more dresses to accommodate for those last-minute weight fluctuations. Dave and Christina, they don't want those bridezillas coming after them. So they
Just, you know what you do on TV when your shirt is too big and they get those lighting clips and just like clip the back of them? Just do that and make sure you don't turn around when you're getting married.
There you go.
I'm not going to weigh in on this one. I think it's probably safest if I don't. Lisa, thank you very much.
Lisa.
Thank you very much. In fewer than 50 days, the World Cup will return to North America for the first time in 22 years.
This comes as the U.S. is still experiencing the longest, partial government shutdown in its history, as well as an increase in immigration enforcement by the Trump administration. Joining us now is Jetr Global Sports and Entertainment founder, CEO Travis Mercy, and Vice President of Global Growth Strategy and Government Affairs, my friend David Francis. David, we're going to start with you. Is the U.S. ready for the World Cup?
You know, Christina, thank you for having us today. I think we are.
Okay.
I mean, we have been working at this for about 3.5 years. Government is working very closely with FIFA. I think the biggest challenge is that we have sort of a fragmented system here in the United States where we have 11 host cities where these events are normally run by one organizing committee.
And the country's quite large. You can't just hop from one to the other.
This is very true, and I think that's something that can also propose some additional stress that might happen with just transportation.
What are the biggest obstacles you're seeing? Is it logistics? Is it transportation? Is it all of the above?
I think it's all of the above. I mean, the logistics are certainly a challenge. I think individuals coming from different countries are going to recognize just how big the United States is. Just planning your trip, you know, if you have to go from Kansas City to Boston, that involves several flights. And then you have to figure out how you're going to get to the stadium.
Travis Murphy, your specialty is immigration in the context of athletics. So I'm curious, kind of at both levels, are you detecting more unease or trepidation among athletes about coming here in light of the heightened enforcement that Christina mentioned? Are you seeing that among fans as well? How much is that a concern, just the uncertainty surrounding immigration policy in this country as all of this unfolds?
Yeah, it absolutely is a significant concern for individuals looking at traveling over. You know, FIFA has done a good job of creating a process for the teams, even some of those that are on travel ban lists, to be able to travel to the United States. We're talking about the teams themselves, players, coaches, physios, the people behind the scenes. But the fans themselves, yeah, there's a lot of concern. And there hasn't been, despite calls for this, really any reassurances that there won't be a heavy-handed security presence who might be pulling people out of the crowd. And so I think there's understandably still a lot of concern.
Your team helps handle some of those negotiations about those teams getting their visas. Is there concern still among members of the team? Have you heard reticence or concern that even though, yes, the paperwork is here, that's not going to be the case once they get here? Or are you satisfied with the U.S. government's response?
I think for the teams themselves, they're going to be fine. The fans are a different question because you're talking about fans coming over. And there's really two ways that fans can come over. There's those that can travel on what's called visa waiver. So that's 42 countries that are allowed to travel without going into an embassy. They just fill out an online application. And that's typically kind of Western Europe, South Korea, Japan, more developed nations, ally nations with high-level information sharing. But then you have visas, people who have to go into a United States embassy and apply for a visa to come to the United States. And there's been a lot of conversation around whether or not people will be approved, if they can get an appointment in time. But then you have this additional layer of complication or concern over, well, what happens when we get there? As David mentioned, there's the transportation element, there's the logistics, there's the price hikes, and frankly, just the barrier to entry to even get a ticket into these games has been widely reported as being the most expensive sporting event in history.
We were talking about that USA-Paraguay game that was like $1,500 minimum or something.
This week, 4 tickets went on sale for the finals game on the secondary market. There were $2 million a ticket.
Wow, incredible. David, let me pull back a bit. We're talking about this in the context of the World Cup, but just since the second Trump term started, has it been more of an issue for athletes who live overseas to come here to the U.S. to join teams and play? Is it something that goes beyond the World Cup, the crucible of the World Cup?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. The administration has added an additional layer. You know, there are things that, exist in Trump 2.0 that didn't exist in the first term. So we have additional travel bans. There are visa waiver bonds that individuals that need to pay if they want to come to the United States. So there's an additional layer. And I think, these federations are trying to figure out how they navigate those different processes. I will say this, the government is working and very communicative about what those policies look like. And so it's a challenge, but we're working through it.
It's not ambiguous. They're willing to engage.
That's correct. Yeah, they're willing to engage.
But when you're dealing with, MLB, NHL, hockey, these big sports firms, and they recruit people from all over the world, are athletes, this is where athletes, for the most part, are getting the best gigs, the highest paying gigs. When they're looking at that risk-benefit analysis, are you hearing any kind of pullback that people are reluctant to even take those slots, not like the really high-paying level, but the lower level? Is that part of the conversation and the thought process for these athletes, whether or not they want to live the next couple years of their lives in the U.S., whether they get their families here, whether this is something they want to deal with?
It's a tough choice, but I think, the benefit that the United States has is that we have the best leagues in the world. Yeah. These players want to come here. They understand that cost risk analysis is that coming to the United States can open pathways and avenues from a commercial standpoint, from a sponsorship and branding. So I think they're willing to take that risk.
Travis, let me ask you about sports diplomacy, which is a phrase we hear around the World Cup. Heard about it during the Olympics a few months back. You were in the Foreign Service officer before. What does it mean today? How vibrant is sports diplomacy at a moment when we've seen, obviously, the U.S.'s diplomatic footprint retrenched under this administration?
Yeah, there's a strange dichotomy here that sports diplomacy, I don't think has ever been as widely utilized. We hear it a lot, as you said, in kind of news. Here in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of different entities that are trying to now figure out how best to engage in sports diplomacy. But it means different things to different people, and we're doing this in an environment where diplomacy isn't necessarily the top priority of the administration. I do think that we're in a unique situation in the United States in that we're one of the very few countries in the world that doesn't have a Ministry of Sports. Most other countries you go to, including Canada and Mexico, have a federal level coordinating body that coordinates sports and sees sports policy as integral to their engagement with foreign countries. We don't have that in the United States. And it's not like the NBA, NFL are looking for more federal government involvement in their day-to-day operations. But at the same time, I think when we look at this landscape of events, the World Cup this summer, the World Military Games next year, the Olympics in 28, and on through the 2034 Winter Games back in Utah, we're seeing this disconnect between widespread government coordination at a sustainable pace. We have a task force in place for the World Cup, but doing a task force for each individual event is obviously pretty inefficient. And so one of the things we've been working on is how do we elevate the conversations around sports where we see that as a real policy tool, get away from this idea of soft power and more towards this idea that sports is frankly one of the most influential aspects of our culture and our society that we have to reach the world.
David, to that point, very quickly before we have to go, what does success look like? If the U.S. wants a sports diplomatic win here, what do these events, the World Cup, the Olympics, what are they looking for? What does that look like?
I mean, first off, it has to be secured. Logistically, I think people need to be able to come and go. I think the athletes need to be able to perform without any distractions. And I think, again, we have 11 host cities in the United States, all of them pulling equal weight, because I think the tournament's success is only going to be as good as our weakest link. So we want to make sure that LA is just as good as Boston and Boston is just good as Dallas and the other.
You think we're going to pull it off?
I think so. I have a good confidence.
Same here?
Yeah, no, it's going to be a great event. Inevitably there will be headlines, there will be hiccups. You can't have 6 million ticketed fans coming in for games and not have a few issues.
All right. Travis Murphy, Dave Francis, thank you guys so much. That was fascinating. We really appreciate you coming on.
Up next, the Pointed News Quiz DC edition. We're going to play that with Lisa Mateo, noted quiz master. Don't get those questions. We might have a special guest playing that game with us as well. As Bloomberg This Weekend broadcast live this weekend from Washington, D.C. on the occasion of the White House Correspondents Association dinner, which is coming up tonight. Stay with us on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, and at Bloomberg.com. Welcome back, and it's now time for this weekend's Pointed News Quiz on the road this weekend in the nation's capital with another guest competitor. Who do we have with us, Christina?
It's Jeff Mason.
I want to win this game, but you have to tell me how it works.
Oh, well,
we can't
fortunately,
do that. That's
Lisa
not
Mateo
our
is
job.
here.
That is Quizmaster Lisa Mateo's job. She'll run you through it.
All right, here's how it's going to work. Okay, so there are 3 categories, Jeff, okay? These are stories from the week, okay? So if you've been keeping up to date with them, we used to have 30, now we have 12 because you're here, 12 chips in front of you. And what you do is, as I say each category, think about how confident you are. Or do you want to place all your bets on the first category? Okay. Or maybe do you want to spread them out evenly? Everybody has a different...
Wow.
All White House stories. It doesn't work like that.
Oh, darn it. Okay.
But if you get it wrong and you place your chips, I get those chips, so you lose them. Yes,
very
If you get it right, you keep them. Okay? All right, you ready
There's
to play?
There's often a bonus round as well.
And there's a bonus round.
Okay.
That's the best part. Okay, here are your categories. Okay, first category is insurance.
Great.
Second category is crypto.
Okay.
And third category is media.
All right,
okay?
great.
So where are we placing our bets?
I think this might be David Gura's week, finally.
You think so?
I think it is.
I feel like you're a secret insurance fiend.
I am not. I'm going to split evenly and pray to the news gods.
All right, splitting evenly.
Okay.
Putting most of my chips into media.
I like that.
I work
most on media.
Most on media? Okay,
and then half the other 2.
And you're putting none on the first insurance.
It's customary for me to skip the first category.
Okay.
Oh, interesting.
You're getting into it.
Yeah.
Let's get to the question.
Okay,
Here's the
insurance.
question for insurance. Live event organizers are using which bespoke form of insurance to protect against nature-related losses?
Wow.
So what is that type of insurance called?
Wait, this isn't multiple choice?
No, you have to write it down as Jeopardy style.
What? If you play it online, they do give you multiple choice. So if you want to play along,
But this is the real world. It's not online, Jeff. So
but here,
you got to use
in the studio, we give you no choices.
I don't even know if this is a real word. I have no idea.
So again, live event organizers using which form of insurance to protect against nature-related losses? Do we have answers written on your boards?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to put 2 down.
Wait, is
Are
it?
we ready? Oh, she's crossing off. She's crossing off. She's trying another route. Oh, Christina's ready.
All right, I don't think that's ready either.
Are you ready?
Okay,
flip it. David, reveal.
I wrote
What did
act
you
of
put?
God or force majeure.
I wrote force majeure.
Force majeure.
I wrote disaster coverage.
Disaster coverage. It's called parametric insurance.
Lisa Mateo.
I'm telling you. Did you know that actually Bad Bunny used it in his concerts in case they get rained out? So
parametric insurance.
Parametric insurance.
You want to hand over your
Who
chips?
knew? Hand over the chips.
Reluctantly.
So at the moment, since David didn't bet on that, he's doing better than us.
right now.
We got to pull it together, man.
Unacceptable.
Agreed. I have never lost to him. If I lose to him, it's going to be you. All right.
It's going to be great. It's great. Okay.
We'll never go back to New York.
But I think I might get you on crypto. I don't know. We'll see. Crypto is the next category.
Crypto, digital
It is.
currency.
And you place a bet.
Yeah.
Good.
No,
Everybody,
we've all got money on it.
Yeah.
Okay. Crypto billionaire Justin Sun is suing which crypto company, saying it is on the verge of collapse? What is the name of that crypto company? His name? crypto billionaire Justin Sun. He's suing this company. What is the name of that company?
Okay.
Jeff, you're not writing anything.
Jeff, do you like the music? Jeff likes the music, I can tell.
Music is
great.
It's soothing.
Yes.
Okay, we got our answers? Let's flip it. Okay. Is it
World Liberty Financial.
Oh, I said Dogecoin.
No idea. Jeff Mason. That's mentally not the winner. You have it correct. David Gura. Ding, ding,
What are we
ding.
doing?
This is his time.
I fought for you to come on this quiz.
Wait, but this is not my fault. You didn't know the answer either.
It's absolutely your fault. It can't be my fault. It's got to be your fault.
I am getting my little
All right,
tips
Lisa,
up
we got
here.
2 minutes left.
All right, here we go. Next one.
Media.
Media. You can make up for it here. Here we go.
I knew this was going to happen.
Satirical news brand The Onion trying to license the intellectual property of which website?
I have to remember the name of it. It's
Oh, it's on the tip of your tongue.
Come on. There we go. I got it.
It's come to her. Okay.
I got it.
What is the name of that website?
Yeah.
We
Thank
have
goodness.
answers.
Okay.
Jeff
Yes.
Mason's on it.
Sorry.
Flip it.
Infowars.
Infowars.
TheOnion.com.
They bought it.
Good try, Jeff. I love that. You are right. It is Infowars. Infowars.
And they've changed the logo, and it's like a rainbow now. It has the onion in the middle of it because in the lawsuit they won it. Yeah.
Oh, this is Ben Collins, who used to be a colleague at MSNBC way back when, but he's now the CEO of The Onion, and he has kind of engineered this entire purchase. It's a wild thing.
That's a great job.
Yeah.
What do they get out of that? That's interesting.
Us talking about it.
Right.
Here
we are. Ding, ding, ding.
Are you ready for a bonus?
I certainly
Oh,
am.
yeah.
because I believe I've won the game.
You need
Then do I get all the
You've got
chips?
0 right now.
Can I come back at the
White
bonus? I
House.
can't come back at the bonus,
you
right?
can't. I think it's all
might be
been
all
preordained,
David Gura.
but I've won the game.
I'll give it to you
Lisa.
anyway. Okay. It's podcasters.
Oh,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
This is my day.
Podcasters.
The company.
Rigged.
Okay. Pull it together. Here we go.
Lisa.
The company Unwell is in turmoil with staff turnover and an influencer feud. So which podcast host is the co-CEO of that company Unwell?
Oh, no.
Unwell. Not doing well.
Wait.
Unwell.
It's the
It's Know Your Podcasters Day here on...
So which podcast host is the co-CEO of Unwell?
Time is nigh.
Oh, Jeff, you're not even trying.
I'm leaving it to these two. I
You're
have
not
no
even
idea.
writing anything.
I used my no idea shit already.
Alex Cooper.
Okay, Alex Cooper.
Yeah, I said call me Daddy, Alex. I couldn't remember the last name. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Alex
She gets credit
Cooper.
for that?
Yes, she gets credit for it.
Lisa Mateo.
Alex, call your daddy.
Alex
Scribble.
Cooper. Call your daddy. Yes, the 4th most popular podcast in the U.S.
A lot of
She's
turmoil there.
leading
And
with
Ashley
Alex
Carmen, our
Earl. I
colleague,
know,
wrote a
it's
big
crazy.
piece about this, and it's been a hit on the Terminal website. Check it out.
I feel like this is the cycle of these young leaders who make all this money, and then it seems to happen across industries,
So
right?
I've heard. I can't speak from experience. Anyways, the Pointed News quiz can be taken at Bloomberg.com/pointed. You can find that on the app as well.
He's going to be insufferable
David
now, Lisa.
Gura.
All day, we're going to have to do this with David Gura as the winner. Thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg this weekend. We are live from D.C. Thanks, Jeff Mason. Joining us in our Washington studio tomorrow, Democratic Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia. See you there starting 7 a.m. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura with Lisa Mateo.